by Evelyn Underhill. First half of Part 2, Chapter 8. Ecstasy and Rapture. Since the object of all contemplation is the production of that state of intimate communion in which the mystics declare that the self is in God and God is in her, it might be supposed that the horizon of union represented the end of mystical activity, in so far as it is concerned with the attainment of a transitory but exalted consciousness of oneness with the Absolute. Nearly all the great contemplators, however, describe as a distinct, and regard as a more advanced phase of the spiritual consciousness, the group of definitely ecstatic states in which the concentration of interest on the transcendent is so complete, the gathering up and pouring out of life on this one point so intense, that the subject is more or less entranced, and becomes, for the time of the ecstasy, unconscious of the external world. In ordinary contemplation he refused to attend to that external world. It was there, a blurred image, at the fringe of his conscious field, but he deliberately left it on one side. In ecstasy he cannot attend to it. None of its messages reach him, not even those most insistent of all messages which are translated into the terms of bodily pain. All mystics agree in regarding such ecstasy as an exceptionally favourable state, the one in which man's spirit is caught up to the most immediate union with the divine. The word has become a synonym for joyous exaltation, for the inebriation of the infinite. The induced ecstasies of the Dionysian mysteries, the metaphysical raptures of the Neoplatonists, the voluntary or involuntary trance of Indian mystics and Christian saints, all these, however widely they may differ in transcendental value, agree in claiming such value, in declaring that this change in the quality of consciousness brought with it a valid and ineffable apprehension of the real. Clearly this apprehension will vary in quality and content with the place of the subject in the spiritual scale. The ecstasy is merely the psychophysical condition which accompanies it. It is hardly a paradox to say, says Myers, that the evidence for ecstasy is stronger than the evidence for any other religious belief. Of all the subjective experiences of religion, ecstasy is that which has been most urgently, perhaps the psychologist most convincingly, asserted, and it is not confined to any one religion. From the medicine man of the lowest savages up to St. John, St. Peter, and St. Paul, with Buddha and Mohammed on the way, we find records which, though morally and intellectually much differing, are in psychological essence the same. There are three distinct aspects under which the ecstatic state may be studied: A, the physical; B, the psychological; C, the mystical. Many of the deplorable misunderstandings and still more deplorable mutual recriminations which surround its discussion come from the refusal of experts in one of these three branches to consider the results arrived at by the other two. A. Physically considered, ecstasy is a trance, more or less deep, more or less prolonged. The subject may slide into it gradually from a period of absorption in, or contemplation of, some idea which has filled the field of consciousness, or it may come on suddenly, the appearance of the idea, or even some word or symbol suggesting the idea, abruptly throwing the subject into an entranced condition. This is the state which some mystical writers call rapture. The distinction, however, is a conventional one, and the works of the mystics describe many intermediate forms. During the trance, breathing and circulation are depressed. The body is more or less cold and rigid, remaining in the exact position which it occupied at the oncoming of the ecstasy, however difficult and unnatural this pose may be. Sometimes entrancement is so deep that there is complete anesthesia, as in the case which I quote from the life of St. Catherine of Siena. Credible witnesses report that Bernadette, the visionary of Lourdes, held the flaming end of a candle in her hand for 15 minutes during one of her ecstasies. She felt no pain, neither did the flesh show any marks of burning. Similar instances of ecstatic anesthesia abound in the lives of the saint, and are also characteristic of certain pathological states. The trance includes, according to the testimony of the ecstatics, two distinct phases. A, the short period of lucidity, and B, a longer period of complete unconsciousness, which may pass into a death-like catalepsy lasting for hours, or, as once with St. Teresa, for days. The difference between union and trance, says Teresa, is this, that the latter lasts longer and is more visible outwardly, because the breathing gradually diminishes, so that it becomes impossible to speak or to open the eyes. And though this very thing occurs when the soul is in union, there is more violence in a trance, for the natural warmth vanishes, I know not how, when the rapture is deep. And in all these kinds of orison there is more or less of this. When it is deep, as I was saying, the hands become cold and sometimes stiff and straight as pieces of wood. As to the body, if the rapture comes on when it is standing or kneeling, it remains so. And the soul is so full of the joy of that which our Lord is setting before it, that it seems to forget to animate the body and abandons it. If the rapture lasts, the nerves are made to feel it. Such ecstasy as this, so far as its physical symptoms go, is not, of course, the peculiar privilege of the mystics. It is an abnormal bodily state, caused by a psychic state, and this causal psychic state may be healthy or unhealthy, the result of genius or disease. It is common in the little understood type of personality called sensitive or mediumistic. It is a well-known symptom of certain mental and nervous illnesses. A feeble mind concentrated on one idea, like a hypnotic subject gazing at one spot, easily becomes entranced, however trivial the idea which gained possession of his consciousness. Apart from its content, then, ecstasy carries no guarantee of spiritual value. It merely indicates the presence of certain abnormal psychophysical conditions, an alteration of the normal equilibrium, a shifting of the threshold of consciousness which leaves the body and the whole usual external world outside instead of inside the conscious field, and even affects those physical functions, such as breathing, which are almost entirely automatic. Thus ecstasy, physically considered, may occur in any person in whom 1. The threshold of consciousness is exceptionally mobile, and 2. There is a tendency to dwell upon one governing idea or intuition. Its worth depends entirely on the objective value of that idea or intuition. In the hysterical patient, thanks to an unhealthy condition of the centres of consciousness, any trivial or irrational idea, any one of the odds and ends stored up in the subliminal region, may thus become fixed, dominate the mind, and produce entrancement. Such ecstasy is an illness. The emphasis is on the pathological state which makes it possible. In the mystic, the idea which fills his life is so great a one, the idea of God, that in proportion as it is vivid, real, and intimate, it inevitably tends to monopolize the field of consciousness. Here the emphasis is on the overpowering strength of spirit, not on the feeble and unhealthy state of body or mind. This true ecstasy, says Godfreneau, is not a malady, but the extreme form of a state which must be classed amongst the ordinary accidents of conscious life. The mystics themselves are fully aware of the importance of this distinction. Ecstasies, no less than visions and voices, must, they declare, be subjected to unsparing criticism before they are recognized as divine. Whilst some are undoubtedly of God, others are no less clearly of the devil. The great doctors of the mystic life, says Malaval, teach that there are 2 sorts of rapture, which must be carefully distinguished. The first are produced in persons but little advanced in the way, and still full of selfhood, either by the force of a heated imagination, which vividly apprehends a sensible object, or by the artifice of the devil. These are the raptures which St. Teresa calls, in various parts of her works, raptures of feminine weakness. The other sort of rapture is, on the contrary, the effect of pure intellectual vision in those who have a great and generous love for God. To generous souls who have utterly renounced themselves, God never fails in these raptures to communicate high things. All the mystics agree with Malaval in finding the test of a true ecstasy, not in its outward sign, but in its inward grace, its after value. and here psychology would do well to follow their example. The ecstatic states, which are supreme instances of the close connection between body and soul, have bodily as well as mental results, and those results are as different and as characteristic as those observed in healthy and in morbid organic processes. If the concentration has been upon the highest centre of consciousness, the organ of spiritual perception, if a door has really been opened by which the self has escaped for an instant to the vision of that which is, the ecstasy will be good for life. The entrancement of disease, on the contrary, is always bad for life, its concentration being upon the lower instead of the higher levels of mentality. It depresses rather than enhances the vitality, the fervour, or the intelligence of its subject, and leaves behind it an enfeebled will, and often moral and intellectual chaos. Ecstasies that do not produce considerable profit either to the persons themselves or others deserve to be suspected, says Augustine Baker, and when any marks of their approaching are perceived, the persons ought to divert their minds some other way. It is the difference between a healthy appetite for nourishing food and a morbid craving for garbage. The same organs of digestion are used in satisfying both, yet he would be a hardy physiologist who undertook to discredit all nutrition by a reference to its degenerate forms. Sometimes both kinds of ecstasy, the healthy and the psychopathic, are seen in the same person. Thus, in the cases of St. Catherine of Genoa and St. Catherine of Siena, it would seem that as their health became feebler, and the nervous instability always found in persons of genius increased, their ecstasies became more frequent. But these were not healthy ecstasies, such as those which they experienced in the earlier stages of their careers, and which brought with them an access of vitality. They were the results of increasing weakness of body, not of the overpowering strength of the spirit. And there is evidence that Catherine of Genoa, that acute self-critic, was conscious of this. Those who attended on her did not know how to distinguish one state from the other, and hence on coming to she would sometimes say, "Why did you let me remain in this quietude from which I have almost died?" Her earlier ecstasies, on the contrary, had in a high degree the positive character of exaltation and life enhancement consequent upon extreme concentration on the absolute, as well as the merely negative character of annihilation of the surface consciousness. She came from them with renewed health and strength, as from a resting in heavenly places and a feeding on heavenly food, and side by side with this ecstatic life fulfilled the innumerable duties of her active vocation as hospital matron and spiritual mother of a large group of disciples. Many times, says her legend, she would hide herself in some secret place and there stay, and being sought she was found upon the ground, her face hidden in her hands, altogether beyond herself, in such a state of joy as is beyond thought or speech. And being called, yea, even in a loud voice, she heard not, and at other times she would go up and down, as if beyond herself, drawn by the impulse of love, she did this. And certain other times she remained for the space of 6 hours as if dead, but hearing herself called, suddenly she got up, and answering she would at once go about all that needed to be done, even the humblest things. And in thus leaving the all, she went without any grief, because she fled all selfhood, la proprietà, as if it were the devil. And when she came forth from her hiding place, her face was rosy as it might be a cherub's, and it seemed as if she might have said, "Who shall separate me from the love of God?" Very often, says St. Teresa, describing the results of such rapturous communion with pure love as that from which St. Catherine came joyous and rosy-faced, he who was before sickly and full of pain comes forth healthy and even with new strength, for it is something great that is given to the soul in rapture. B. Psychologically considered, all ecstasy is a form, the most perfect form, of the state which is technically called complete monoideism, that withdrawal of consciousness from circumference to centre, that deliberate attention to one thing, which we discussed in recollection, is here pushed, voluntarily or involuntarily, to its logical conclusion. It is 1. always paid for by psychophysical disturbances. 2. Rewarded in healthy cases by an enormous lucidity, a supreme intuition in regard to the one thing on which the self's interest has been set. Such ecstasy, then, is an exalted form of contemplation, and might be expected in appropriate subjects to develop naturally from that state. A simple difference of degree, says Maury, separates ecstasy from the action of forcibly fixing an idea in the mind. Contemplation implies exercise of will, and the power of interrupting the extreme tension of the mind. In ecstasy, which is contemplation carried to its highest pitch, the will, although in the strictest sense able to provoke the state, is nevertheless unable to suspend it. In complete monoideism, then, the attention to one thing, and the inattention to all else, is so entire that the subject is entranced. Consciousness has been withdrawn from those centres which receive and respond to the messages of the external world. He neither sees, feels, nor hears. The ego dormio et cor meum vigilat of the contemplative ceases to be a metaphor, and becomes a realistic description. It must be remembered that the whole trend of mystical education has been toward the production of this fixity of attention. Recollection and quiet led up to it. Contemplation cannot take place without it. All the mystics assure us that a unification of consciousness, in which all outward things are forgot, is the necessary prelude of union with the divine. For consciousness of the many and consciousness of the one are mutually exclusive states. Ecstasy, for the psychologist, is such a unification in its extreme form. The absorption of the self in the one idea, the one desire, is so profound, and in the case of the great mystics, so impassioned, that everything else is blotted out. The tide of life is withdrawn, not only from those higher centres which are the seats of perception and of thought, but also from those lower centres which govern the physical life. The whole vitality of the subject is so concentrated on the transcendental world, or, in a morbid ecstatic, on the idea which dominates his mind, that body and brain alike are depleted of their energy in the interests of this supreme act. Since mystics have, as a rule, the extreme susceptibility to suggestions and impressions which is characteristic of artistic and creative types, it is not surprising that their ecstasies are often evoked, abruptly, by the exhibition of, or concentration upon, some loved and special symbol of the divine. Such symbols form the rallying points about which are gathered a whole group of ideas and intuitions. Their presence, sometimes the sudden thought of them, will be enough, in psychological language, to provoke a discharge of energy along some particular path. That is to say, to stir to life all those ideas and intuitions which belong to the self's consciousness of the Absolute, to concentrate vitality on them, and introduce the self into that world of perception of which they are, as it were, the material keys. Hence the profound significance of symbols for some mystics, their paradoxical clinging to outward forms, whilst declaring that the spiritual and intangible alone is real. For the Christian mystics, the sacraments and mysteries of faith have always provided such a point d'appui, and these often play a large part in the production of their ecstasies. For St. Catherine of Siena, and also very often for her namesake of Genoa, the reception of Holy Communion was the prelude to ecstasy. Julian of Norwich and St. Francis of Assisi became entranced whilst gazing on the crucifix. We are told of Denis the Carthusian that towards the end of his life, hearing the Veni Creator, or certain verses of the Psalms, he was at once wrapped in God and lifted up from the earth. Of St. Catherine of Siena, her biographer says that she used to communicate with such fervour that immediately afterwards she would pass into the state of ecstasy, in which for hours she would be totally unconscious. On one occasion, finding her in this condition, they, the Dominican friars, forcibly threw her out of the church at midday, and left her in the heat of the sun, watched over by some of her companions till she came to her senses. Another, catching sight of her in the church when she was in ecstasy, came down and pricked her in many places with a needle. Catherine was not aroused in the least from her trance, but afterwards, when she came back to her senses, she felt the pain in her body and perceived that she had thus been wounded. It is interesting to compare with this objective description the subjective account of ecstatic union which St. Catherine gives in her Divine Dialogue. Here, the deeper self of the mystic is giving in a dramatic form its own account of its inward experiences. Hence we see the inward side of that outward state of entrancement, which was all that onlookers were able to perceive. As usual in the dialogue, the intuitive perceptions of the deeper self are attributed by St. Catherine to the divine voice speaking in her soul. Oftentimes, through the perfect union which the soul has made with me, she is raised from the earth almost as if the heavy body became light. But this does not mean that the heaviness of the body is taken away, but that the union of the soul with me is more perfect than the union of the body with the soul. Wherefore the strength of the spirit, united with me, raises the weight of the body from the earth, leaving it as if immovable, and all pulled to pieces in the affection of the soul. Thou rememberest to have heard it said of some creatures, that were it not for my goodness, in seeking strength for them, they would not be able to live, and I would tell thee that, in the fact that the souls of some do not leave their bodies, is to be seen a greater miracle than in the fact that some have arisen from the dead. So great is the union which they have with me. I, therefore, sometimes for a space withdraw from the union, making the soul return to the vessel of her body, from which she was separated by the affection of love. From the body she did not depart, because that cannot be except in death. The bodily powers alone departed, becoming united to me through affection of love. The memory is full of nothing but me. The intellect, elevated, gazes upon the object of my truth. The affection, which follows the intellect, loves and becomes united with that which the intellect sees. These powers being united and gathered together and immersed and inflamed in me, the body loses its feeling, so that the seeing eye sees not, and the hearing ear hears not, and the tongue does not speak, except as the abundance of the heart will sometimes permit it, for the alleviation of the heart, and the praise and glory of my name. The hand does not touch and the feet walk not, because the members are bound with the sentiment of love. A healthy ecstasy so deep as this seems to be the exclusive prerogative of the mystics, perhaps because so great a passion, so profound a concentration, can be produced by nothing smaller than their flaming love of God. But as the technique of contemplation is employed more or less consciously by all types of creative genius, by inventors and philosophers, by poets, prophets, and musicians, by all the followers of the Triple Star, no less than by the mystic saints, so too this apotheosis of contemplation, the ecstatic state, sometimes appears in a less violent form, acting healthily and normally in artistic and creative personalities at a complete stage of development. It may accompany the prophetic intuitions of the seer, the lucidity of the great metaphysician, the artist's supreme perception of beauty or truth. As the saint is caught up to God, so these are caught up to their vision, their partial apprehensions of the absolute life. Those joyous, expansive, outgoing sensations, characteristic of the ecstatic consciousness, are theirs also. Their greatest creations are translations to us, not of something they have thought, but of something they have known, in a moment of ecstatic union with the great life of the all. We begin then to think that the pure monoideism which the psychologist identifies with ecstasy, though doubtless a part, is far from being the whole content of this state. True, the ecstatic is absorbed in his one idea, his one love. He is in it and with it. It fills his universe. But this unified state of consciousness does not merely pour upon something already possessed. When it only does this, it is diseased. Its true business is pure perception. It is outgoing, expansive. Its goal is something beyond itself. The rearrangement of the psychic self which occurs in ecstasy is not merely concerned with the normal elements of consciousness. It is rather a temporary unification of consciousness round that centre of transcendental perception which mystics call the apex or the spark of the soul. Those deeper layers of personality which normal life keeps below the threshold are active in it, and these are fused with the surface personality by the governing passion, the transcendent love which lies at the basis of all sane ecstatic states. The result is not merely a mind concentrated on one idea, nor a heart fixed on one desire, nor even a mind and a heart united in the interests of a beloved thought, but a whole being welded into one, all its faculties, neglecting their normal universe, grouped about a new centre, serving a new life, and piercing, like a single flame, the barriers of the sensual world. Ecstasy is the psychophysical state which may accompany this brief synthetic act. C. Therefore, whilst on its physical side ecstasy is an entrancement, on its mental side a complete unification of consciousness, on its mystical side it is an exalted act of perception. It represents the greatest possible extension of the spiritual consciousness in the direction of pure being. The blind intent stretching here receives its reward in a profound experience of eternal life. In this experience, the departmental activities of thought and feeling, the consciousness of I-hood, of space and time, all that belongs to the world of becoming and our own place therein, are suspended. The vitality which we are accustomed to split amongst these various things is gathered up to form a state of pure apprehension, a vivid intuition of, or, if you like, conjunction with, the transcendent. For the time of his ecstasy, the mystic is, for all practical purposes, as truly living in the supersensual world as the normal human animal is living in the sensual world. He is experiencing the highest and most joyous of those temporary and unstable states, those passive unions, in which his consciousness escapes from the limitations of the senses, rises to freedom, and is united for an instant with the great life of the all. Ecstasy, then, from the contemplative's point of view, is the development and completion of the horizon of union, and he is not always at pains to distinguish the two degrees, a fact which adds greatly to the difficulties of students. In both states, though he may, for want of better language, describe his experience in terms of sight, the transcendent is perceived by contact, not by vision. As, enfolded in darkness with one whom we love, we obtain a knowledge far more complete than that conferred by the sharpest sight, the most perfect mental analysis. In ecstasy, the apprehension is perhaps more definitely beatific than in the horizon of union. Such memory of his feeling state as the ecstatic brings back with him is more often concerned with an exultant certainty, a conviction that he has known for once the reality which hath no image, and solved the paradox of life, than with meek self-loss in that cloud of unknowing, where the contemplative in union is content to meet his beloved. The true note of ecstasy, however, its only valid distinction from infused contemplation, lies in entrancement, in being ravished out of fleshly feeling, as St. Paul caught up to the third heaven, not in the lifting of mind unto God. This, of course, is an outward distinction only, and a rough one at that, since entrancement has many degrees, but it will be found the only practical basis of classification. Probably none but those who have experienced these states know the actual difference between them. Even St. Teresa's psychological insight fails her here, and she is obliged to fall back on the difference between voluntary and involuntary absorption in the divine, a difference not in spiritual values, but merely in the psychophysical constitution of those who have perceived these values. I wish I could explain with the help of God, she says, wherein union differs from rapture, or from transport, or from flight of the spirit, as they call it, or from trance, which are all one. I mean that all these are only different names for that one and the same thing, which is also called ecstasy. It is more excellent than union, the fruits of it are much greater, and its other operations more manifold, for union is uniform in the beginning, the middle, and the end, and is so also interiorly. But as raptures have ends of a much higher kind, they produce effects both within and without, i.e. both physical and psychical. A rapture is absolutely irresistible, whilst union, inasmuch as we are then on our own ground, may be hindered, though that resistance be painful and violent. End of first half of Part 2, Chapter 8. Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness, by Evelyn Underhill. Second half of Part 2, Chapter 8. From the point of view of mystical psychology, our interest in ecstasy will centre in 2 points. 1. What has the mystic to tell us of the object of his ecstatic perception? 2. What is the nature of the peculiar consciousness which he enjoys in his trance? That is to say, what news does he bring us as to the being of God and the powers of man? It may be said generally that on both these points he bears out, amplifies, and expresses under formulae of greater splendour, with an accent of greater conviction, the general testimony of the contemplatives. In fact, we must never forget that an ecstatic is really nothing else than a contemplative of a special kind, with a special psychophysical make-up. Moreover, we have seen that it is not always easy to determine the exact point at which entrancement takes place, and deep contemplation assumes the ecstatic form. The classification, like all classifications of mental states, is an arbitrary one, whilst the extreme cases present no difficulty. There are others less complete, which form a graduated series between the deeps of the quiet and the heights of rapture. We shall never know, for instance, whether the ecstasies of Plotinus and of Pascal involved true bodily entrancement, or only a deep absorption of the unitive kind. So too the language of many Christian mystics when speaking of their raptures is so vague and metaphorical that it leaves us in great doubts as to whether they mean by rapture the abrupt suspension of normal consciousness, or merely a sudden and agreeable elevation of soul. Ravishing, says Rolle, as it is showed, in 2 ways is to be understood. One manner, forsooth, in which a man is ravished out of fleshly feeling, so that for the time of his ravishing, plainly he feels naught in flesh, nor what is done of his flesh, and yet he is not dead, but quick, for yet the soul to the body gives life. And on this manner saints sometime are ravished, to their profit and other men's learning, as Paul ravished to the 3rd heaven. And on this manner sinners also in vision sometime are ravished, that they may see joys of saints and pains of damned for their correction. And many other as we read of. Another manner of ravishing there is, that is lifting of mind into God by contemplation. And this manner of ravishing is in all that are perfect lovers of God, and in none of them but that love God. And as well this is called a ravishing as the other, for with a violence it is done, and as it were against nature. It is, however, very confusing to the anxious inquirer when, as too often, lifting of mind by contemplation is as well called a ravishing as the other, and ecstasy is used as a synonym for gladness of heart. Here, so far as is possible, these words will be confined to their strict meaning, and not applied generally to the description of all the outgoing and expansive states of the transcendental consciousness. What does the mystic claim that he attains in this abnormal condition, this irresistible trance? The price that he pays is heavy, involving much psychophysical wear and tear. He declares that his rapture or ecstasy includes a moment, often a very short and always an indescribable moment, in which he enjoys a supreme knowledge of, or participation in, divine reality. He tells us under various metaphors that he then attains pure being, his source, his origin, his beloved, is engulfed in the very thing for which he longs, which is God. O wonder of wonders, cries Eckhart, when I think of the union the soul has with God. He makes the enraptured soul to flee out of herself, for she is no more satisfied with anything that can be named. The spring of divine love flows out of the soul and draws her out of herself into the unnamed being, into her first source, which is God alone. This momentary attainment of the source, the origin, is the theme of all descriptions of mystic ecstasy. In Rulman Merswin's Book of the Nine Rocks, that brief and overwhelming rapture is the end of the pilgrim's long trials and ascents. The vision of the infinite lasted only for a moment. When he came to himself, he felt inundated with life and joy. He asked, "Where have I been?" And he was answered, "In the upper school of the Holy Spirit." There you were surrounded by the dazzling pages of the Book of Divine Wisdom. Your soul plunged therein with delight, and the Divine Master of the school has filled her with an exuberant love by which even your physical nature has been transfigured. Another friend of God, Alina von Krevelsheim, who was of so abnormal a psychic constitution that her absorption in the divine love caused her to remain dumb for 7 years, was touched by the hand of God at the end of that period, and fell into a 5 days' ecstasy, in which pure truth was revealed to her, and she was lifted up to an immediate experience of the Absolute. There she saw the interior of the Father's heart, and was bound with chains of love, enveloped in light, and filled with peace and joy. In this transcendent act of union, the mystic sometimes says that he is conscious of nothing. But it is clear that this expression is figurative, for otherwise he would not have known that there had been an act of union. Were his individuality abolished, it could not have been aware of its attainment of God. What he appears to mean is that consciousness so changes its form as to be no longer recognizable or describable in human speech. In the paradoxical language of Richard of St. Victor, in a wondrous fashion, remembering we do not remember, seeing we do not see, understanding we not understand, penetrating we do not penetrate. In this indescribable but most actual state, the whole self, exalted and at white heat, is unified and poured out in one vivid act of impassioned perception, which leaves no room for reflection or self-observation. That aloof somewhat in us, which watches all our actions, splits our consciousness, has been submerged. The mystic is attending exclusively to eternity, not to his own perception of eternity. That he can only consider when the ecstasy itself is at an end. All things I then forgot, my cheek on him who for my coming came. All ceased, and I was not, leaving my cares and shame among the lilies, and forgetting them. This is that perfect unity of consciousness, that utter concentration on an experience of love which excludes all conceptual and analytic acts. Hence, when the mystic says that his faculties were suspended, that he knew all and knew naught, he really means that he was so concentrated on the Absolute that he ceased to consider his separate existence, so merged in it that he could not perceive it as an object of thought, as the bird cannot see the air which supports it, nor the fish the ocean in which it swims. He really knows all, but thinks naught, perceives all, but conceives naught. The ecstatic consciousness is not self-conscious. It is intuitive, not discursive. Under the sway of a great passion, possessed by a great idea, it has become a single state of enormous intensity. In this state it transcends our ordinary processes of knowledge and plunges deep into the heart of reality. A fusion which is the anticipation of the unitive life takes place, and the ecstatic returns from this brief foretaste of freedom, saying, "I know, as having known, the meaning of existence." The sane centre of the universe, at once the wonder and the assurance of the soul. This utter transformation of the soul in God, says St. Teresa, describing the same experience in the official language of theology, continues only for an instant. Yet while it continues, no faculty of the soul is aware of it, or knows what is passing there. Nor can it be understood while we are living on the earth. At least God will not have us understand it, because we must be incapable of understanding it. I know is by experience. The utterances of those who know by experience are here of more worth than all the statements of psychology, which are concerned of necessity with the outward signs of this inward and spiritual grace. To these we must go if we would obtain some hint of that which ecstasy may mean to the ecstatic. When the soul, forgetting itself, dwells in that radiant darkness, says Suso, it loses all its faculties and all its qualities, as St. Bernard has said, and this more or less completely, according to whether the soul, whether in the body or out of the body, is more or less united to God. This forgetfulness of self is, in a measure, a transformation in God, who then becomes, in a certain manner, all things for the soul, as Scripture saith. In this rapture the soul disappears, but not yet entirely. It acquires, it is true, certain qualities of divinity, but does not naturally become divine. To speak in the common language, the soul is wrapped by the divine power of resplendent being, above its natural faculties, into the nakedness of the nothing. Here Suso is trying to describe his rapturous attainment of God in the negative terms of Dionysian theology. It is probable that much of the language of that theology originated not in the abstract philosophizings, but in the actual ecstatic experience of the Neoplatonists, who, Christian and pagan alike, believed in, and sometimes deliberately induced, this condition as the supreme method of attaining the One. The whole Christian doctrine of ecstasy, on its metaphysical side, really descends from that great practical transcendentalist Plotinus, who is known to have been an ecstatic, and has left in his sixth Aeneid a description of the mystical trance obviously based upon his own experiences. Then, he says, the soul neither sees nor distinguishes by seeing, nor imagines that there are two things, but becomes, as it were, another thing, ceases to be itself and belong to itself. It belongs to God and is one with him, like two concentric circles. Concurring they are one, but when they separate, they are two. Since in this conjunction with deity they were not two things, but the perceiver was one with the thing perceived, if a man can preserve the memory of what he was when he mingled with the divine. Nature and Development of Spiritual Consciousness by Evelyn Underhill. First half of Part 2, Chapter 9. The Dark Night of the Soul. We have wandered during the last few chapters from our study of the mystical life process in man, the organic growth of his transcendental consciousness, in order to examine the byproducts of that process, its characteristic forms of self-expression, the development of its normal art of contemplation, and the visions and voices, ecstasies and raptures, which are frequent, though not essential, accompaniments of its activity. But the mystic, like other persons of genius, is man first and artist afterwards. We shall make a grave though common mistake if we forget this and allow ourselves to be deflected from our study of his growth in personality by the wonder and interest of his art. Being, not doing, is the first aim of the mystic, and hence should be the first interest of the student of mysticism. We have considered for convenience' sake all the chief forms of mystical activity at the halfway house of the transcendental life. But these activities are not, of course, peculiar to any one stage of that life. Ecstasy, for instance, is as common a feature of mystical conversion as of the last crisis, or mystic marriage of the soul, whilst visions and voices, in selves of a visionary or auditive type, accompany and illustrate every phase of the inward development. They lighten and explain the trials of purgation as often as they express the joys of illumination, and frequently mark the crisis of transition from one mystic state to the next. One exception, however, must be made to this rule. The most intense period of that great swing back into darkness, which usually divides the first mystic life, or illuminative way, from the second mystic life, or unitive way, is generally a period of utter blankness and stagnation, so far as mystical activity is concerned. The dark night of the soul, once fully established, is seldom lit by visions or made homely by voices. It is of the essence of its miseries that the once possessed power of horizon or contemplation now seems wholly lost. The self is tossed back from its hard-won point of vantage. Impotence, blankness, solitude are the epithets by which those immersed in this dark fire of purification describe their pains. It is this period in the life history of the mystic type to which we have now come. We have already noticed the chief psychological characteristics of all normal mystical development. We have seen that its essence consists in the effort to establish a new equilibrium, to get, as it were, a firm foothold upon transcendent levels of reality, and that in its path towards this consummation the self experiences a series of oscillations between states of pleasure and states of pain. Put in another way, it is an orderly movement of the whole consciousness towards higher centres, in which each intense and progressive affirmation fatigues the immature transcendental powers, and is paid for by a negation, a swing-back of the whole consciousness, a stagnation of intellect, a reaction of the emotions, or an inhibition of the will. Thus the exalted consciousness of divine perfection, which the self acquired in its mystical awakening, was balanced by a depressed and bitter consciousness of its own inherent imperfection, and the clash of these two perceptions spurred it to that laborious effort of commendation which constitutes the purgative way. The renewed and ecstatic awareness of the Absolute which resulted, and which was the governing characteristic of illumination, brought its own proper negation, the awareness, that is to say, of the self's continued separation from, and incompatibility with, that Absolute which it has perceived. During the time in which the illuminated consciousness is fully established, the self, as a rule, is perfectly content, believing that in its vision of eternity, its intense and loving consciousness of God, it has reached the goal of its quest. Sooner or later, however, psychic fatigue sets in. The state of illumination begins to break up. The complementary negative consciousness appears, and shows itself as an overwhelming sense of darkness and deprivation. This sense is so deep and strong that it inhibits all consciousness of the transcendent, and plunges the self into the state of negation and misery which is called the dark night. We may look at the dark night, as at most other incidents of the mystic way, from 2 points of view. 1. We may see it with the psychologist, as a moment in the history of mental development, governed by the more or less mechanical laws which so conveniently explain to him the psychic life of man. Or, 2, with the mystic himself, we may see it in its spiritual aspect as contributing to the remaking of character, the growth of the new man, his transmutation in God. Psychologically considered, the dark night is an example of the operation of the law of reaction from stress. It is a period of fatigue and lassitude following a period of sustained mystical activity. It is one of the best established laws of the nervous system, says Starbuck, that it has periods of exhaustion if exercised continuously in one direction, and can only recuperate by having a period of rest. However spiritual he may be, the mystic, so long as he is in the body, cannot help using the machinery of his nervous and cerebral system in the course of his adventures. His development on its psychic side consists in the taking over of this machinery, the capture of its centres of consciousness, in the interests of his growing transcendental life. In so far, then, as this is so, that transcendental life will be partly conditioned by psychic necessities, and amenable to the laws of reaction and of fatigue. Each great step forward will entail lassitude and exhaustion for that mental machinery which he has pressed unto service and probably overworked. When the higher centres have been submitted to the continuous strain of a developed illuminated life, with its accompanying periods of intense fervour, lucidity, deep contemplation, perhaps of visionary and auditive phenomena, the swing back into the negative state occurs almost of necessity. This is the psychological explanation of those strange and painful episodes in the lives of great saints, indeed of many spiritual persons hardly to be classed as saints, when, perhaps after a long life passed in faithful correspondence with the transcendental order, growing consciousness of the presence of God, the whole inner experience is suddenly swept away, and only a blind reliance on past conviction saves them from unbelief. The great contemplatives, those destined to attain the full stature of the mystic, emerge from this period of destitution, however long and drastic it may be, as from a new purification. It is for them the gateway to a higher state. But persons of a less heroic spirituality, if they enter the night at all, may succumb to its dangers and pains. The great negation is the sorting-house of the spiritual life. Here we part from the nature mystics, the mystic poets, and all who shared in and were contented with the illuminated vision of reality. Those who go on are the great and strong spirits, who do not seek to know, but are driven to be. We are to expect, then, as a part of the conditions under which human consciousness appears to work, that for every affirmation of the mystic life there will be a negation waiting for the unstable self. Progress in contemplation, for instance, is marked by just such an alternation of light and shade, at first between consolation and aridity, then between dark contemplation and sharp intuitions of reality. So too in selves of extreme nervous instability, each joyous ecstasy entails a painful or negative ecstasy. The states of darkness and illumination coexist over a long period, alternating sharply and rapidly. Many seers and artists pay in this way, by agonizing periods of impotence and depression, for each violent outburst of creative energy. Rapid oscillations between a joyous and a painful consciousness seem to occur most often at the beginning of a new period of the mystic way, between purgation and illumination, and again between illumination and the dark night. For these mental states are, as a rule, gradually not abruptly established. Mystics call such oscillations the game of love in which God plays, as it were, hide-and-seek with the questing soul. I have already quoted a characteristic instance from the life of Woolman Merswan, who passed the whole intervening period between his conversion and entrance on the dark night, or school of suffering love, in such a state of disequilibrium. Thus too Madame Guyon, who has described with much elaboration of detail her symptoms and sufferings during the oncoming and duration of the night, or, as she calls its intensest period, the mystic death, traces its beginning in short recurrent states of privation or dullness of feeling, such as ascetic writers call aridity, in which the self loses all interest in and affection for those divine realities which had previously filled its life. This privation followed upon, or was the reaction from, an illuminated period of extreme joy and security, in which, as she says, the presence of God never left me for an instant, but how dear I paid for this time of happiness, for this possession which seemed to me entire and perfect, and the more perfect the more it was secret, and foreign to the senses, steadfast and exempt from change, was but the preparation for a total deprivation, lasting many years, without any support or hope of its return. As Madame Guyon never attempted to control her states, but made a point of conforming to her own description of the resigned soul as God's weathercock, we have in her an unequalled opportunity of study. I endured, she says, long periods of privation, towards the end almost continual, but still I had from time to time inflowings of thy divinity so deep and intimate, so vivid and so penetrating, that it was easy for me to judge that thou wast but hidden from me and not lost. For although during the times of privation it seemed to me that I had utterly lost thee, a certain deep support remained, though the soul knew it not, and she only became aware of that support by her subsequent total deprivation thereof. Every time that thou didst return with more goodness and strength, thou didst return also with greater splendour, so that in a few hours thou didst rebuild all the ruins of my unfaithfulness, and didst make good to me with profusion all my lost. Here we have, from the psychological point of view, a perfect example of the oscillations of consciousness on the threshold of a new state. The old equilibrium, the old grouping round a centre characterized by pleasure affirmation, has been lost. The new grouping round a centre characterized by pain negation is not yet established. Madame Guyon is standing, or rather swinging, between two worlds, the helpless prey of her own shifting and uncontrollable psychic and spiritual states. But slowly the pendulum approaches its limit. The states of privation become almost continual. The reactions to illumination become less. At last they cease entirely. The new state is established, and the dark night has really set in. The theory here advanced that the dark night is, on its psychic side, partly a condition of fatigue, partly a state of transition, is borne out by the mental and moral disorder which seems, in many subjects, to be its dominant character. When they are in it, everything seems to go wrong with them. They are tormented by evil thoughts and abrupt temptations, lose grasp not only of their spiritual, but also of their worldly affairs. Thus Lucy Christine says, "Often during my great temptations to sadness, I am plunged in such spiritual darkness that I think myself utterly lost in falsehood and illusion, deceiving both myself and others. This temptation is the most terrible of all." The health of those passing through this phase often suffers. They become odd, and their friends forsake them. Their intellectual life is at a low ebb. In their own words, trials of every kind, exterior and interior crosses, abound. Now trials, taken en bloc, mean a disharmony between the self and the world with which it has to deal. Nothing is a trial when we are able to cope with it efficiently. Things try us when we are not adequate to them, when they are abnormally hard or we abnormally weak. This aspect of the matter becomes prominent when we look further into the history of Madame Guyon's experiences. Thanks to the unctuous and detailed manner in which she has analyzed her spiritual griefs, this part of her autobiography is a psychological document of unique importance for the study of the dark night as it appears in a devout but somewhat self-occupied soul. As her consciousness of God was gradually extinguished, a mental and moral chaos seems to have invaded Madame Guyon and accompanied the more spiritual miseries of her state. So soon as I perceived the happiness of any state, or its beauty, or the necessity of a virtue, it seemed to me that I fell incessantly into the contrary vice, as if this perception, which though very rapid was always accompanied by love, were only given to me that I might experience its opposite. I was given an intense perception of the purity of God, and so far as my feelings went, I myself became more and more impure. For in reality this state is very purifying, but I was far from understanding this. My imagination was in a state of appalling confusion, and gave me no rest. I could not speak of thee, O my God, for I became utterly stupid. Nor could I even grasp what was said when I heard thee spoken of. I found myself hard towards God, insensible to his mercies. I could not perceive any good thing that I had done in my whole life. The good appeared to me evil, and, that which is terrible, it seemed to me that this state must last for ever. This world as well as the next seemed leagued against her. Loss of health and friendship, domestic vexations, increased and kept pace with her interior griefs. Self-control and power of attention were diminished. She seemed stupefied and impotent, unable to follow or understand even the services of the Church, incapable of all prayer and all good works, perpetually attracted by those worldly things which she had renounced, yet quickly wearied by them. The neat edifice of her first mystic life was in ruins. The state of consciousness which accompanied it was disintegrated, but nothing arose to take its place. It is an amazing thing, says Madame Guyon naively, for a soul that believed herself to be advanced in the way of perfection, when she sees herself thus go to pieces all at once. So too Suso, when he had entered the upper school of the spiritual life, was tormented not only by temptations and desolations, but by outward trials and disabilities of every kind, calumnies, misunderstandings, difficulties, pains. It seemed at this time as if God had given permission both to men and demons to torment the servitor, he says. This sense of a generally inimical atmosphere, and of the dimness and helplessness of the ego oppressed by circumstances, is like the vague distress and nervous sensibility of adolescence, and comes in part from the same cause, the intervening period of chaos between the break-up of an old state of equilibrium and the establishment of the new. The self, in its necessary movement towards higher levels of reality, loses and leaves behind certain elements of its world, long loved but now outgrown, as children must make the hard transition from nursery to school. Destruction and construction here go together. The exhaustion and ruin of the illuminated consciousness is the signal for the onward movement of the self towards other centres. The feeling of deprivation and inadequacy, which comes from the loss of that consciousness, is an indirect stimulus to new growth. The self is being pushed into a new world where it does not feel at home, has not yet reached the point at which it enters into conscious possession of its second or adult life. "Thou hast been a child at the breast, a spoiled child," said the eternal wisdom to Suso. "Now I will withdraw all this." In the resulting darkness and confusion, when the old and known supports are thus withdrawn, the self can do little but surrender itself to the inevitable process of things, to the operation of that unresting spirit of life which is pressing it on towards a new and higher state, in which it shall not only see reality, but be real. Psychologically, then, the dark night of the soul is due to the double fact of the exhaustion of an old state and the growth towards a new state of consciousness. It is a growing pain in the organic process of the self's attainment of the Absolute. The great mystics, creative geniuses in the realm of character, have known instinctively how to turn these psychic disturbances to spiritual profit. This dullness and dimness extends to ordinary mental activity, which shares in the lassitude and disorder of the inner life. If it seeks relief from the fire by spiritual reading, it cannot find any, just as if it could not read at all. On one occasion it occurred to me to read the life of a saint, that I might forget myself and be refreshed with the recital of what he had suffered. 4 or 5 times I read as many lines, and though they were written in Spanish, I understood them less at the end than I did when I began, so I gave up. It so happened to me on more occasions than one. If we are reminded of anything here, it is of the phenomenon of dark contemplation. That dimness of mind which we there studied is here extended to the normal activities of the surface intelligence. The cloud of unknowing, rolling up, seems to envelop the whole self. Contemplation, the way within the way, has epitomized the greater process of this mystic life. In both, the path to light lies through a meek surrender to the confusion and ignorance of the dark. The stress and exasperation felt in this dark, this state of vague helplessness, by selves of an active and self-reliant type, is exhibited by Teresa in one of her half-humorous self-revealing flashes. "The devil," she says of it, "then sends so offensive a spirit of bad temper that I think I could eat people up." All these types of darkness, with their accompanying and overwhelming sensations of impotence and distress, are common in the lives of the mystics. Suso and Rilman Merswin experienced them. Tauler constantly refers to them. Angelo Foligno speaks of a privation worse than hell. It is clear that even the joyous spirit of Mechtild of Magdeburg knew the sufferings of the loss and absence of God. "Lord," she says in one place, "since thou hast taken from me all that I had of thee, yet of thy grace leave me the gift which every dog has by nature, that of being true to thee in my distress, when I am deprived of all consolation. This I desire more fervently than thy heavenly kingdom." In such a saying as this, the whole value for life of the dark night is revealed to us as an education in selfless constancy, a school of suffering love. E. There is, however, another way in which the self's sense of a continued imperfection in its relation with the Absolute, of work yet remaining to be done, expresses itself. In persons of a very highly strung and mobile type, who tend to rapid oscillations between pain and pleasure states, rather than to the long, slow movements of an ascending consciousness, attainment of the unitive life is sometimes preceded by the abrupt invasion of a wild and unendurable desire to see God, apprehend the transcendent in its fullness, which can only, they think, be satisfied by death. As they begin to outgrow their illuminated consciousness, these selves begin also to realize how partial and symbolic that consciousness, even at its best, has been, and their movement to union with God is foreshadowed by a passionate and uncontrollable longing for ultimate reality. This passion is so intense that it causes acute anguish in those who feel it. It brings with it all the helpless and desolate feelings of the dark night, and sometimes rises to the heights of a negative rapture, an ecstasy of deprivation. St. Teresa is perhaps the best instance of this rare method of apprehending the self's essential separation from its home, which is also the subject of a celebrated chapter in the Traité de l'amour de Dieu of St. François de Sales. Thanks to her exceptionally mobile temperament, her tendency to rush up and down the scale of feeling, Teresa's states of joyous rapture were often paid for by such a great desolation, a dark ecstasy or pain of God. As long as this pain lasts, she says, we cannot even remember our own existence, for in an instant all the faculties of the soul are so fettered as to lie incapable of any action save that of increasing our torture. Do not think I am exaggerating. On the contrary, that which I say is less than the truth, for lack of words in which it may be expressed. This is a trance of the senses and the faculties, save as regards all which helps to make the agony more intense. The understanding realizes acutely what cause there is for grief in separation from God, and our Lord increases this sorrow by a vivid manifestation of himself. The pain thus grows to such a degree that in spite of herself the sufferer gives vent to loud cries which she cannot stifle, however patient and accustomed to pain she may be, because this is not a pain which is felt in the body, but in the depths of the soul. The person I speak of learned from this how much more acutely the spirit is capable of suffering than the body. The intense and painful concentration upon the divine absence which takes place in this dark rapture often induces all the psychophysical marks of ecstasy. Although this state lasts but a short time, the limbs seem to be disjointed by it. The pulse is as feeble as if one were at the point of death, which is indeed the case, for whilst the natural heat of the body fails, that which is supernatural so burns the frame that with a few more degrees God would satisfy the soul's desire for death. You will say, perhaps, that there is imperfection in this desire to see God, and ask why this soul does not conform herself to his will, since she has so completely surrendered herself to it. Hitherto she could do this, and consecrated her life to it, but now she cannot, for her reason is reduced to such a state that she is no longer mistress of herself and can think of nothing but her affliction. Far from her sovereign good, why should she desire to live? She feels an extraordinary loneliness, finds no companionship in any earthly creature. Nor could she, I believe, among those who dwell in heaven, since they are not her beloved. Meanwhile all company is torture to her. She is like a person suspended in mid-air, who can neither touch the earth nor mount to heaven. She burns with a consuming thirst and cannot reach the water. And this is a thirst which cannot be borne, but one which nothing will quench. Nor would she have it quenched with any other water than that of which our Lord spoke to the Samaritan woman, and this water is denied her. All these forms of the dark night, the absence of God, the sense of sin, the dark ecstasy, the loss of the self's old passion, peace, and joy, and its apparent relapse to lower spiritual and mental levels, are considered by the mystics themselves to constitute aspects or parts of one and the same process, the final purification of the will or stronghold of personality, that it may be merged without any reserve in God where it was first. The function of this episode of the mystic way is to cure the soul of the innate tendency to seek and rest in spiritual joys, to confuse reality with the joy given by the contemplation of reality. It is the completion of that ordering of disordered loves, that transvaluation of values, which the way of purgation began. The ascending self must leave these childish satisfactions, make its love absolutely disinterested, strong, and courageous, abolish all taint of spiritual gluttony. A total abandonment of the individualistic standpoint, of that trivial and egotistic quest of personal satisfaction which thwarts the great movement of the flowing light, is the supreme condition of man's participation in reality. thus is true not only of the complete participation which is possible to the great mystic, but of those unselfish labours in which the initiates of science or of art become to the eternal goodness what his own hand is to a man. Think not, says Tauler, that God will be always caressing his children, or shine upon their head, or kindle their hearts as he does at the first. He does so only to lure us to himself, as the falconer lures the falcon with its grey hood. We must stir up and rouse ourselves, and be content to leave off learning, and no more enjoy feeling and warmth, and must now serve the Lord with strenuous industry and at our own cost. This manly view of the dark night, as a growth in responsibility, an episode of character-building, in which, as the Mirror of Simple Souls has it, the soul leaves that pride and play wherein it was full gladsome and jolly, is characteristic of the German mystics. We find it again in Suso, to whom the angel of his tribulation gave no sentimental consolations, but only the stern command, Virilite agite, be a man. Then first, says Tauler again, do we attain to the fullness of God's love as his children, when it is no longer happiness or misery, prosperity or adversity that draws us to him, or keeps us back from him. What we should then experience none can utter, but it would be something far better than when we were burning with the first flame of love, and had great emotion, but less true submission. End of first half of part 2, chapter 9. Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness, by Evelyn Underhill. Second half of part 2, chapter 9. In illumination, the soul, basking in the uncreated light, identified the divine nature with the divine light and sweetness which it then enjoyed. Its consciousness of the transcendent was chiefly felt as an increase of personal vision and personal joy. Thus, in that apparently selfless state, the I, the me, the mine, though spiritualized, still remained intact. The mortification of the senses was more than repaid by the rich and happy life which this mortification conferred upon the soul. But before real and permanent union with the Absolute can take place, before the whole self can learn to live on those high levels where, its being utterly surrendered to the infinite will, it can be wholly transmuted in God, merged in the great life of the All, this dependence on personal joys must be done away. The spark of the soul, the fast-growing germ of divine humanity, must so invade every corner of character that the self can only say with St. Catherine of Genoa, "My me is God, nor do I know my selfhood except in God." The various torments and desolations of the dark night constitute this last and drastic purgation of the spirit, the doing away of separateness, the annihilation of selfhood, even though all that self now claims for its own be the love of God. Such a claim, which is really a claim to entire felicity, since the soul which possesses it needs nothing more, is felt by these great spirits to sully the radiance of their self-giving love. All that I would here say of these inward delights and enjoyments, says William Law, is only this: they are not holiness, they are not piety, they are not perfection. But they are God's gracious allurements and calls to seek after holiness and spiritual perfection, and ought rather to convince us that we are as yet but babes, than that we are ready men of God. This alone is the true kingdom of God, opened in the soul when, stripped of all selfishness, it has only one love and one will in it, when it has no motion or desire but what branches from the love of God, and resigns itself wholly to the will of God. To sum up all in a word, nothing hath separated us from God but our own will, or rather our own will is our separation from God. All the disorder and corruption and malady of our nature lies in a certain fixedness of our own will, imagination, and desire, wherein we live to ourselves, are our own centre and circumference, act wholly from ourselves, according to our own will, imagination, and desires. There is not the smallest degree of evil in us, but what arises from this selfishness, because we are thus all in all to ourselves. To be humble, mortified, devout, patient in a certain degree, and to be persecuted for our virtues, is no hurt to this selfishness. Nay, spiritual self must have all these virtues to subsist upon, and his life consists in seeing, knowing, and feeling the bulk, strength, and reality of them. But still, in all this show and glitter of virtue, there is an unpurified bottom on which they stand. There is a selfishness which can no more enter into the kingdom of heaven than the grossness of flesh and blood can enter into it. What we are to feel and undergo in these last purifications, when the deepest root of all selfishness, as well spiritual as natural, is to be plucked up and torn from us, or how we shall be able to stand in that trial, are both of them equally impossible to be known by us beforehand. The self, then, has got to learn to cease to be its own centre and circumference, to make that final surrender which is the price of final peace. In the dark night, the starved and tortured spirit learns through an anguish which is itself an horizon, to accept lovelessness for the sake of love, nothingness for the sake of the all, dies without any sure promise of life, loses when it hardly hopes to find. It sees with amazement the most sure foundations of its transcendental life crumble beneath it, dwells in a darkness which seems to hold no promise of a dawn. This is what the German mystics call the upper school of true resignation, or of suffering love, the last test of heroic detachment, of manliness, of spiritual courage. Though such an experience is passive in the sense that the self can neither enter nor leave it at will, it is a direct invitation to active endurance, a condition of stress in which work is done. Thus, when St. Catherine of Siena was tormented by hideous visions of sin, she was being led by her deeper self to the heroic acceptance of this subtle form of torture, almost unendurable to her chaste and delicate mind. When these trials had brought her to the point at which she ceased to resist them, but exclaimed, "I have chosen suffering for my consolation," their business was done. They ceased. More significant still when she asked, "Where wast thou, Lord, when I was tormented by this foulness?" The divine voice answered, "I was in thy heart." In order to raise the soul from imperfection, said the voice of God to St. Catherine in her dialogue, I withdrew myself from her sentiment, depriving her of former consolations, which I do in order to humiliate her, and cause her to seek me in truth, and to prove her in the light of faith, so that she come to prudence. Then, if she love me without thought of self, and with lively faith, and with hatred of her own sensuality, she rejoices in the time of trouble, deeming herself unworthy of peace and quietness of mind. Now comes the second of the three things of which I told thee, that is to say, how the soul arrives at perfection, and what she does when she is perfect. This is what she does. Though she perceives that I have withdrawn myself, she does not on that account look back, but perseveres with humility in her exercises, remaining barred in the house of self-knowledge, and, continuing to dwell therein, awaits with lively faith the coming of the Holy Spirit, that is of me, who am the fire of love. This is what the soul does in order to rise from imperfection and arrive at perfection. And it is to this end, namely, that she may arrive at perfection, that I withdraw from her, not by grace but by sentiment. Once more do I leave her, so that she may see and know her defects, so that feeling herself deprived of consolation and afflicted by pain, she may recognize her own weakness, and learn how incapable she is of stability or perseverance, thus cutting down to the very root of spiritual self-love. For this should be the end and purpose of all her self-knowledge, to rise above herself, mounting the throne of conscience, and not permitting the sentiment of imperfect love to turn again in its death struggle, but with correction and reproof digging up the root of self-love with the knife of self-hatred and the love of virtue.
digging up the root of self-love with the knife of self-hatred. Here we see the mystical reason of that bitter self-contempt and sense of helplessness which overwhelms the soul in the dark night. Such a sense of helplessness is really, the mystics say, a mark of progress, the deeper initiation into that sphere of reality to which it has not yet acclimatized, and which brings with it a growing consciousness of the appalling disparity between that reality, that perfection, and the imperfect soul. The self is in the dark because it is blinded by a light greater than it can bear, that divine wisdom which is not only night and darkness to the soul, but pain and torment too. The more clear the light, the more does it blind the eyes of the owl, and the more we try to look at the sun, the feebler grows our sight, and the more our weak eyes are darkened. So the divine light of contemplation, when it beats on the soul not yet perfectly purified, fills it with spiritual darkness, not only because of its brilliance, but because it paralyzes the natural perception of the soul. The pain suffered by the soul is like that endured by weak or diseased eyes when suddenly struck by a strong light. Such suffering is intense when the yet unpurified soul finds itself invaded by this cleansing light. For in this pure light, which attacks its impurities to expel them, the soul perceives itself to be so unclean and miserable that it seems as if God had set himself against it. Wonderful and piteous sight! So great are the weakness and imperfection of the soul that the hand of God, so soft and so gentle, is felt to be so heavy and oppressive, though merely touching it, and that too most mercifully, for he touches the soul, not to chastise it, but to load it with his graces. The dark night, then, whichever way we look at it, is a state of disharmony, of imperfect adaptation to environment. The self, unaccustomed to that direct contact of the Absolute which is destined to become the source of its vitality and its joy, feels the soft and gentle touch of the following love as unbearable in its weight. The self-naughting or purification of the will which here takes place is the struggle to resolve that disharmony, to purge away the somewhat which still sets itself up in the soul as separate from the divine, and makes the clear light of reality a torment instead of a joy. So deeply has the soul now entered into the great stream of spiritual life, so dominant has her transcendental faculty become, that this process is accomplished in her whether she will or no, and in this sense it is, as ascetic writers sometimes call it, a passive purgation. So long as the subject still feels himself to be somewhat, he has not yet annihilated selfhood and come to that ground where his being can be united with the being of God. Only when he learns to cease thinking of himself at all, in however depreciatory a sense, when he abolishes even such selfhood as lies in a desire for the sensible presence of God, will that harmony be attained. This is the naughting of the soul, the utter surrender to the great movement of the absolute life, which is insisted upon at such length by all writers upon mysticism. Here, as in purgation, the condition of access to higher levels of vitality is a death, a deprivation, a detachment, a clearing of the ground. Poverty leaps to the cross, and finds there an utter desolation, without promise of spiritual reward. The satisfactions of the spirit must now go the same way as the satisfactions of the senses. Even the power of voluntary sacrifice and self-discipline is taken away. A dreadful ennui, a dull helplessness takes its place. The mystic motto, I am nothing, I have nothing, I desire nothing, must now express not only the detachment of the senses, but the whole being's surrender to the all. The moral condition towards which the interior travail is directed is that of an utter humility. Everything depends, says Tauler, on a fathomless sinking in a fathomless nothingness. He continues, if a man were to say, Lord, who art thou, that I must follow thee through such deep, gloomy, miserable paths? The Lord would reply, I am God and man, and far more God. If a man could answer then, really and consciously from the bottom of his heart, then I am nothing and less than nothing, all would be accomplished, for the Godhead has really no place to work in, but ground where all has been annihilated. The absence of God whom he loved, the enmity of man whom he feared, were the chief forces brought to play upon him, and we watch his slow growth under their tonic influence in courage, humility, and fraternal love. Few chapters in the history of the mystics are more touching than that passage in Suso's life, where we speak of an extraordinary trial which the servitor had to bear. It tells how a malicious woman accused him of being the father of her child, and succeeded for the time in entirely destroying his reputation. And the scandal was all the greater, says the servitor with his customary simplicity, because the rumour of that brother's sanctity had spread so far. Poor Suso was utterly crushed by this calumny, wounded to the depths of his heart. "Lord, Lord," he cried, "every day of my life I have worshipped thy holy name in many places, and have helped to cause it to be loved and honoured by many men. And now thou wouldst drag my name through the mud." When the scandal was at its height, a woman of the neighbourhood came to him in secret, and offered to destroy the child which was the cause of this gossip, in order that the tale might be more quickly forgotten and his reputation restored. She said further that unless the baby were somehow disposed of, he would certainly be forced by public opinion to accept it and provide for its upbringing. Suso, writhing as he was under the contempt of the whole neighbourhood, the apparent ruin of his career, knowing too that this slander of one of their leaders must gravely injure the reputation of the friends of God, was able to meet the temptation with a noble expression of trust. "I have confidence in the God of heaven, who is rich, and who has given me until now all that which was needful unto me. He will help me to keep, if need be, another beside myself." And then he said to his temptress, "Go, fetch the little child, that I may see it." And when he had the baby, he put it on his knees and looked at it, and the baby began to smile at him. And sighing deeply, he said, "Could I kill a pretty baby that smiled at me? No, no, I had rather suffer every trial that could come upon me." And turning his face to the unfortunate little creature, he said to it, "O my poor, poor little one, thou art but an unhappy orphan, for thy unnatural father hath denied thee. Thy wicked mother would cast thee off, as one casts off a little dog that has ceased to please. The providence of God hath given thee to me, in order that I may be thy father. I wilt accept thee then from him and from none else. Ah, dear child of my heart, thou liest on my knees, thou dost gaze at me, thou canst not yet speak. As for me, I contemplate thee with a broken heart, with weeping eyes and lips that kiss, I bedew thy little face with my burning tears. Thou shalt be my son, and the child of the good God, and as long as heaven gives me a mouthful, I shall share it with thee, for the greater glory of God, and will patiently support all the trials that may come to me, my darling son." How different is this from the early Suso, interested in little but his own safe spirituality, with more than a touch of the religious aesthete. The story goes on, and when the hard-hearted woman who had wished to kill the little one saw these tears, when she heard these tender words, she was greatly moved, and her heart was filled with pity, and she too began to weep and cry aloud. The servitor was obliged to calm her, for fear that, attracted by the noise, some one should come and see what was going on. And when she had finished weeping, the brother gave her back the baby, and blessed it, and said to it, "Now may God in his goodness bless thee, and may the saints protect thee against all evil that may be." And he enjoined the woman to care for it well at his expense. Small wonder that after this heroic act of charity, Suso's reputation went from bad to worse, that even his dearest friends forsook him, and he narrowly escaped expulsion from the religious life. His torments and miseries, his fears for the future, continued to grow until at last they came to their term in a sort of mental crisis. His feeble nature broken by the pains which he had to endure, he went forth raving like one who has lost his sense, and hid himself in a place far from men, where none could see or hear him. And whilst he suffered thus, several times something which came from God said within his soul, "Where then is your resignation?
Where is that equal humour in joy and in tribulation which you have so lightly taught other men to love? In what manner is it, then, that one should rest in God and have confidence only in him?" He replied, weeping, "You ask where is my resignation? But tell me first, where is the infinite pity of God for his friends? O fathomless abyss, come to my help, for without thee I am lost. Thou knowest that thou art my only consolation, that all my trust is only in thee. O hear me, for the love of God, all you whose hearts are wounded. Behold, let none be scandalized by my insane behaviour. So long as it was only a question of preaching resignation, that was easy. But now that my heart is pierced, now that I am wounded to the marrow, how can I be resigned?" And after thus suffering half a day, his brain was exhausted, and at last he became calmer, and sitting down he came to himself, and turning to God, and abandoning himself to his will, he said, "If it cannot be otherwise, fiat voluntas tua." The act of submission was at once followed by an ecstasy and vision, in which the approaching end of his troubles was announced to him. And in the event, God came to the help of the servitor, and little by little that terrible tempest died away. Thus with Suso, as with St. Catherine of Siena, and other mystics whom we have considered, the travail of the dark night is all directed towards the essential mystic act of utter self-surrender, that fiat voluntas tua, which marks the death of selfhood in the interests of a new and deeper life. He has learned the lesson of the school of true resignation, has moved to a new stage of reality, a complete self-noughting, an utter acquiescence in the large and hidden purpose of the divine will. Anzi affamare ed esta beata esse tenerse dentro alla divina voglia per confansi nostra voglia stesse. Nay, it is essential to this blessed being to hold ourselves within the will divine, that therewith our own wills be themselves made one, says Piccarda, announcing the primary law of paradise. Suso has passed through the fire to the state in which he too can say, La sua volontate è nostra pace. The old grouping of his consciousness round spiritual self has come to its head and at last broken down. In the midst of a psychic storm parallel to the upheavals of conversion, mercenary love is for ever disestablished. The new state of pure love is abruptly established in its place. Human pain is the price, the infinite joy peculiar to free souls is the reward. We may study the pain, but the nature of the joy is beyond us, as, in the absolute type of all mystic achievement, we see the cross clearly, but can hardly guess at the true nature of the resurrection life. Hence Suso's description of his establishment in the unitive way seems meagre and anticlimax after all that went before. And later, he says simply, when God judged that it was time, he rewarded the poor martyr for all his suffering, and he enjoyed peace of heart, and received in tranquillity and quietness many precious graces. And he praised the Lord from the very depths of his soul, and thanked him for those same sufferings, which, for all the world, he would not now have been spared. And God caused him to understand that by this complete abasement he had gained more, and was made the more worthy to be raised up to God, than by all the pains which he had suffered from his youth up to that time. End of Part 2, Chapter 9. Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness, by Evelyn Underhill. First half of Part 2, Chapter 10. The Unitive Life. What is the unitive life? We have referred to it often enough in the course of this inquiry. At last we are face to face with the necessity of defining its nature if we can. Since the normal man knows little about his own true personality, and nothing at all about that of deity, the orthodox description of it as the life in which man's will is united with God does but echo the question in an ampler form, and conveys no real meaning to the student's mind. That we should know by instinct its character from within, as we know, if we cannot express, the character of our own normal human lives, is of course impossible. We deal here with the final triumph of the spirit, the flower of mysticism, humanity's top note, the consummation towards which the contemplative life, with its long, slow growth and costly training, has moved from the first. We look at a small but ever-growing group of heroic figures living at transcendent levels of reality which we, immersed in the poor life of illusion, cannot attain, breathing an atmosphere whose true quality we cannot even conceive. Here, then, as at so many other points in our study of the spiritual consciousness, we must rely for the greater part of our knowledge upon the direct testimony of the mystics, who alone can tell the character of that more abundant life which they enjoy. Yet we are not wholly dependent on this source of information. It is the peculiarity of the unit of life that it is often lived, in its highest and most perfect forms, in the world, and exhibits its works before the eyes of men. As the law of our bodies is earth to earth, so, strangely enough, is the law of our souls. The spirit of man, having at last come to full consciousness of reality, completes the circle of being, and returns to fertilize those levels of existence from which it sprang. Hence the enemies of mysticism, who have easily drawn a congenial moral from the morbid and solitary lives of contemplatives in the earlier and educative stages of the mystic way, are here confronted very often by the disagreeable spectacle of the mystic as a pioneer of humanity, a sharply intuitive and painfully practical person, an artist, a discoverer, a religious or social reformer, a national hero, a great active amongst the saints. By the superhuman nature of that which these persons accomplish, we can gauge something of the supernormal vitality of which they partake. The things done, the victories gained over circumstances by St. Bernard or St. Joan of Arc, by St. Catherine of Siena, St. Ignatius Loyola, St. Teresa, George Fox, are hardly to be explained unless these great spirits had indeed a closer, more intimate, more bracing contact than their fellows with that life which is the light of men. We have, then, these two lines of investigation open to us. First, the comparison and elucidation of that which the mystics tell us concerning their transcendent experience. Secondly, the testimony which is borne by their lives to the existence within them of supernal springs of action, contact set up with deep levels of vital power. In the third place, we have such critical machinery as psychology has placed at our disposal. But this, in dealing with these giants of the spirit, must be used with peculiar caution and humility. The unit of life, though so often lived in the world, is never of it. It belongs to another plane of being, moves securely upon levels unrelated to our speech, and hence eludes the measuring powers of humanity. We, from the valley, can only catch a glimpse of the true life of these elect spirits transfigured upon the mountain. They are far away, breathing another air. We cannot reach them. Yet it is impossible to overestimate their importance for the race. They are our ambassadors to the Absolute. They vindicate humanity's claim to the possible and permanent attainment of reality. Bear witness to the practical qualities of the transcendental life. In Euchin's words, they testify to the advent of a triumphing spiritual power, as distinguished from a spirituality which merely lays the foundations of life or struggles to maintain them, to the actually life-enhancing power of the love of God, once the human soul is freely opened to the whole of the mystic way. The deepest, richest levels of human personality have now attained to light and freedom. The self is remade, transformed, has at last unified itself, and with the cessation of stress, power has been liberated for new purposes. The beginning of the mystic life, says Delacroix, introduced into the personal life of the subject a group of states which are distinguished by certain characteristics, and which form, so to speak, a special psychological system. At its term, it has, as it were, suppressed the ordinary self, and by the development of this system has established a new personality with a new method of feeling and of action. Its growth results in the transformation of personality. It abolishes the primitive consciousness of selfhood and substitutes for it a wider consciousness, a total disappearance of selfhood in the divine, the substitution of a divine self for the primitive self. We give a philosophic content to this conception if we say further that man, in this unitive state, by this substitution of the divine for the primitive self, has at last risen to true freedom, entered on the fruition of reality. Hence he has opened up new paths for the inflow of that triumphing power which is the very substance of the real, has remade his consciousness, and in virtue of this total regeneration is transplanted into that universal life therein, which no merely personal language, taken alone, can touch. Thus Boehme, trying to describe the union between the word and the soul, says, "I give you an earthly similitude of this. Behold a bright flaming piece of iron, which of itself is dark and black, and the fire so penetrateth and shineth through the iron, that it giveth light. Now the iron doth not cease to be, it is iron still, and the source or property of the fire retaineth its own propriety. It doth not take the iron into it, but it penetrateth and shineth through the iron, and it is the iron then as well as before, free in itself. And so also is the source or property of the fire. In such a manner is the soul set in the deity. The deity penetrateth through the soul, and dwelleth in the soul, yet the soul doth not comprehend the deity, but the deity comprehendeth the soul, but doth not alter it from being a soul, but only giveth it the divine source or property of the majesty." Almost exactly the same image of deification was used 500 years before Boehme's day by Richard of St. Victor, a mystic whom he is hardly likely to have read. When the soul is plunged in the fire of divine love, he says, like iron it first loses its blackness, and then growing to a white heat, it becomes like unto the fire itself. And lastly it grows liquid, and losing its nature, is transmuted into an utterly different quality of being. As the difference between iron that is cold and iron that is hot, he says again, so is the difference between soul and soul, between the tepid soul and the soul made incandescent by divine love. Other contemplatives say that the deified soul is transfigured by the inundations of the uncreated light, that it is like a brand blazing in the furnace, transformed to the likeness of the fire. These souls, says the divine voice to St. Catherine of Siena, thrown into the furnace of my charity, no part of their will remaining outside, but the whole of them being inflamed in me, are like a brand, wholly consumed in the furnace, so that no one can take hold of it to extinguish it, because it has become fire. In the same way no one can seize these souls or draw them outside of me, because they are made one thing with me through grace, and I never withdraw myself from them by sentiment, as in the case of those whom I am leading on to perfection. For the most subtle and delicate descriptions of the unitive or deified state, understood as self-loss in the ocean Pacific of God, we must go to the great genius of Rusbroek. He alone, whilst avoiding all its pitfalls, has conveyed the suggestion of its ineffable joys in a measure which seems, as we read, to be beyond all that we had supposed possible to human utterance. Awe and rapture, theological profundity, keen psychological insight, are here tempered by a touching simplicity. We listen to the report of one who has indeed heard the invitation of love, which draws interior souls towards the one, and says, "Come home." A humble receptivity, a meek self-naughting, is with Rusbroek, as with all great mystics, the gate of the city of God. Because they have abandoned themselves to God in doing, in leaving undone, and in suffering, he says of the deified souls, they have steadfast peace and inward joy, consolation and savour, of which the world cannot partake, neither any dissembler, nor the man who seeks and means himself more than the glory of God. Moreover, those same inward and enlightened men have before them in their inward seeing, whenever they will, the love of God as something drawing or urging them into the unity. For they see and feel that the Father with the Son through the Holy Ghost embrace each other and all the chosen, and draw themselves back with eternal love into the unity of their nature. Thus the unity is ever drawing to itself and inviting to itself everything that has been born of it, either by nature or by grace. And therefore too such enlightened men are, with a free spirit, lifted up above reason into a bare and imageless vision, wherein lives the eternal indrawing summons of the divine unity. And with an imageless and bare understanding they pass through all works and all exercises and all things until they reach the summit of their spirits. There their bare understanding is drenched through by the eternal brightness, even as the air is drenched through by the sunshine. And the bare, uplifted will is transformed and drenched through by abysmal love, even as iron is by fire. And the bare, uplifted memory feels itself enwrapped and established in an abysmal absence of image. And thereby the created image is united above reason in a threefold way with its eternal image, which is the origin of its being and its life. Yet the creature does not become God, for the union takes place in God through grace and our homeward-turning love. And therefore the creature in its inward contemplation feels a distinction and an otherness between itself and God. And though the union is without means, yet the manifold works which God works in heaven and on earth are nevertheless hidden from the spirit. For though God gives himself as he is with clear discernment, he gives himself in the essence of the soul, where the powers of the soul are simplified above reason, and where, in simplicity, they suffer the transformation of God. There all is full and overflowing, for the spirit feels itself to be one truth and one richness and one unity with God. Yet even here there is an essential tending forward, and therein is an essential distinction between the being of the soul and the being of God. And this is the highest and finest distinction which we are able to feel. When love has carried us above and beyond all things, he says in another place, above the light, into the divine dark, there we are wrought and transformed by the eternal Word, who is the image of the Father, and as the air is penetrated by the sun, thus we receive in idleness of spirit the incomprehensible light, enfolding us and penetrating us. And this flight is nothing else but an infinite gazing and seeing. We behold that which we are, and we are that which we behold, because our thought, life, and being are uplifted in simplicity and made one with the truth which is God. Here the personal aspect of the Absolute seems to be reduced to a minimum. Yet all that we value in personality, love, action, will, remains unimpaired. We seem caught up to a plane of vision beyond the categories of the human mind, to the contemplation of a something other, our home, our hope, and our passion, the completion of our personality, and the substance of all that is. Such an endless contemplation, such a dwelling within the substance of goodness, truth, and beauty, is the essence of that beatific vision, that participation of eternity, of all things most delightful and desired, of all the things most loved by them who have it, which theology presents to us as the objective of the soul. Those mystics of the metaphysical type who tend to use these impersonal symbols of place and thing often see in the unitive life a foretaste of the beatific vision, an entrance here and now into that absolute life within the divine being, which shall be lived by all perfect spirits when they have cast off the limitations of the flesh and re-entered the eternal order for which they were made. For them, in fact, the deified man, in virtue of his genius for transcendental reality, has run ahead of human history, and attained a form of consciousness which other men will only know when earthly life is past. In the Book of Truth, Suso has a beautiful and poetic comparison between the life of the blessed spirits dwelling within the ocean of divine love, and that approximate life which is lived on earth by the mystic who has renounced all selfhood and merged his will in that of the eternal truth. Here we find one of the best of many answers to the ancient but apparently immortal accusation that the mystics teach the total annihilation of personality as the end and object of their quest. "Lord, tell me," says the servitor, "what remains to a blessed soul which has wholly renounced itself?" Truth says, when the good and faithful servant enters into the joy of his Lord, he is inebriated by the riches of the house of God, for he feels in an ineffable degree that which is felt by an inebriated man. He forgets himself, he is no longer conscious of his selfhood, he disappears and loses himself in God, and becomes one spirit with him, as a drop of water which is drowned in a great quantity of wine. For even as such a drop disappears, taking the colour and the taste of wine, so it is with those who are in full possession of blessedness. All human desires are taken from them in an indescribable manner. They are rapt from themselves and are immersed in the divine will. If it were otherwise, if there remained in the man some human thing that was not absorbed, those words of Scripture which say that God must be all in all would be false. His being remains, but in another form, in another glory, and in another power. And all this is the result of entire and complete renunciation. Herein thou shalt find an answer to thy question, for the true renunciation and veritable abandonment of a man to the divine will in the temporal world is an imitation and reduction of that self-abandonment of the blessed of which Scripture speaks. And this imitation approaches its model more or less, according as men are more or less united with God, and become more or less one with God. Remark well that which is said of the blessed. They are stripped of their personal initiative, and changed into another form, another glory, another power. What then is this other form, if it be not the divine nature and the divine being whereinto they pour themselves, and which pours itself into them, and becomes one thing with them? And what is that other glory, if it be not to be illuminated and made shining in the inaccessible light? What is that other power, if it be not that by means of his union with the divine personality, there is given to man a divine strength and a divine power, that he may accomplish all which pertains to his blessedness, and omit all which is contrary thereto? And thus it is that, as has been said, a man comes forth from his selfhood. All the mystics agree that the stripping off of the I, the me, the mine, utter renouncement or self-naughting, self-abandonment to the direction of a larger will, is an imperative condition of the attainment of the unitive life. The temporary denudation of the mind, whereby the contemplative made space for the vision of God, must now be applied to the whole life. Here, they say, there is a final swallowing up of that wilful I-hood, that surface individuality which we ordinarily recognize as ourselves. It goes for ever, and something new is established in its room. The self is made part of the mystical body of God, and, humbly taking its place in the corporate life of reality, would fain be to the eternal goodness what his own hand is to a man. That strange hunger and thirst of God for the soul, at once avid and generous, of which they speak in their profoundest passages, here makes its final demand and receives its satisfaction. All that he has, all that he is, he gives. All that we have, all that we are, he takes. The self, they declare, is devoured, immersed in the abyss, sinks into God, who is the deep of deeps. In their efforts towards describing to us this, the supreme mystic act, and the new life to which it gives birth, they are often driven to the use of images which must seem to us grotesque, were it not for the flame which burns behind. As when Rusborough cries, "To eat and be eaten, this is union. Since his desire is without measure, to be devour of him does not greatly amaze me." B. At this point we begin to see that the language of deification, taken alone, will not suffice to describe the soul's final experience of reality. The personal and emotional aspect of man's relation with his source is also needed if that which he means by union with God is to be even partially expressed. Hence, even the most transcendental mystic is constantly compelled to fall back on the language of love in the endeavour to express the content of his metaphysical raptures, and forced in the end to acknowledge that the perfect union of lover and beloved cannot be suggested in the precise and arid terms of religious philosophy. Such arid language eludes the most dangerous aspects of divine union, the pantheistic on one hand, the amoristic on the other. But it also fails to express the most splendid state of that amazing experience. It needs some other, more personal and intimate vision to complete it. And this we shall find in the reports of those mystics of the intimate type to whom the unitive life has meant not self-loss in an essence, but self-fulfillment in the union of heart and will. The extreme form of this kind of apprehension, of course, finds expression in the well-known and heartily abused symbolism of the spiritual marriage between God and the soul, a symbolism which goes back to the Orphic mysteries, and thence descended via the Neoplatonists into the stream of Christian tradition. But there are other and less concrete embodiments of it, wholly free from the dangers which are supposed to lurk in erotic imagery of this kind. Thus Jalaluddin, by the use of metaphors which are hardly human, yet charged with passionate feeling, tells, no less successfully than the writer of the Song of Songs, the secret of his union in which heart speaks to heart. With thy sweet soul, this soul of mine hath mixed as water doth with wine. Who can the wine and water part, or me and thee when we combine? Thou art become my greater self, small bounds no more can me confine. Thou hast my being taken on, and shall not I now take on thine? Me thou for ever hast affirmed, that I may ever know thee mine. Thy love has pierced me through and through, its thrill with bone and nerve entwine. I rest a flute laid on thy lips, a lute I on thy breast recline. Breathe deep in me that I may sigh, yet strike my strings, and tears shall shine. What the mystic here desires to tell us is that his new life is not only a free and conscious participation in the life of eternity, a fully established existence on real and transcendental levels, but also the conscious sharing of an inflowing personal life greater than his own, a tightening of the bonds of that companionship which has been growing in intimacy and splendour during the course of the mystic way. This companionship, at once the most actual and most elusive fact of human experience, is utterly beyond the resources of speech. So too are those mysteries of the communion of love, whereby the soul's humble, active, and ever-renewed self-donation becomes the occasion of her glory, and by her love she is made the equal of love, the beggar-maid sharing Cophetua's throne. Thus the anonymous author of The Mirror writes, in one of his most daring passages, "I am God, says love, for love is God and God is love. And this soul is God by condition of love, but I am God by nature divine. And this state is hers by righteousness of love, so that this precious beloved of me is learned, and led of me without her working. This soul is the eagle that flies high, so right high and yet more high than doth any other bird, for she is feathered with fine love." The simplest expression of the unitive life, the simplest interpretation which we can put on its declarations, is that it is the complete and conscious fulfilment, here and now, of this perfect love. In it certain elect spirits, still in the flesh, fly high and yet more high, till taught and led out of themselves, they become, in the exaggerated language of the Mirror, God by condition of love. Home-grown English mysticism tried as a rule to express the inexpressible in homelier, more temperate terms than this. "I would that thou knew," says the unknown author of the Epistle of Prayer, "what manner of working it is that knitteth man's soul to God, and that maketh it one with him in love and accordance of will, after the word of St. Paul, saying thus, Quid heret Deo, unus spiritus est Camillo, that is to say, Whoso draweth near to God, as it is by such a reverent affection touched before, he is one spirit with God. That is, though all that God and he be two and seer in kind, nevertheless yet in grace they are so knit together, that they are but one in spirit. And all this is one for one head of love and accordance of will. And in this one head is the marriage made between God and the soul, the which shall never be broken, though all that the heat and the fervour of this work cease for a time, but by a deadly sin. In the ghostly feeling of this one head may a loving soul both say and sing, if it list, this holy word that is written in the book of songs in the Bible. Dilectus meus, me et ego illi, that is, my loved unto me, and I unto him, understanding that God shall be knitted with the ghostly glue of grace on his party, and the lovely consent in gladness of spirit on thy party. I think no one can deny that the comparison of the bond between the soul and the Absolute to ghostly glue, though crude, is wholly innocent. Its appearance in this passage as an alternative to the symbol of wedlock may well check the uncritical enthusiasm of those who hurry to condemn at sight all sexual imagery. That it has seemed to the mystics appropriate and exact is proved by its reappearance in the next century in the work of a greater contemplative. Thou givest me, says Peterson, thy whole self to be mine whole and undivided, if at least I shall be thine whole and undivided. And when I shall be thus all thine, even as from everlasting thou hast loved thyself, so from everlasting thou hast loved me. For this means nothing more than that thou enjoyest thyself in me, and that I by thy grace enjoy thee in myself and myself in thee. And when in thee I shall love myself, nothing else but thee do I love, because thou art in me and I in thee, glued together as one and the self-same thing, which henceforth and forever cannot be divided. From this kind of language to that of the spiritual marriage, as understood by the pure minds of the mystics, is but a step. They mean by it no rapturous satisfactions, no dubious spiritualizing of earthly ecstasies, but a lifelong bond that shall never be lost or broken, a close personal union of will and of heart between the free self and that fairest in beauty whom it has known in the act of contemplation. The mystic way has been a progress, a growth in love, a deliberate fostering of the inward tendency of the soul towards its source, an eradication of its disorderly tendencies to temporal goods. But the only proper end of love is union, a perfect uniting and coupling together of the lover and the loved into one. It is a unifying principle, the philosophers say, life's mightiest agent upon every plane. Moreover, just as earthly marriage is understood by the moral sense less as a satisfaction of personal desire than as a part of the great process of life, the fusion of two selves for new purposes, so such spiritual marriage brings with it duties and obligations. With the attainment of a new order, the new infusion of vitality, comes a new responsibility, the call to effort and endurance on a new and mighty scale. It is not an act, but a state. Fresh life is imparted, by which our lives are made complete. New creative powers are conferred. The self, lifted to the divine order, is to be an agent of the divine fecundity, an energizing centre, a parent of transcendental life. The last perfection, says Aquinas, to supervene upon a thing, is its becoming the cause of other things. While then a creature tends by many ways to the likeness of God, the last way left open to it is to seek the divine likeness by being the cause of other things, according to what the Apostle says, Dei enim sumus adjutoris. End of first half of part 2, chapter 10. By Evelyn Underhill. Second half of part 2, chapter 10. We find, as a matter of fact, when we come to study the history of the mystics, that the permanent unitive state, or spiritual marriage, does mean for those who attain to it, above all else, such an access of creative vitality. It means man's small derivative life invaded and enhanced by the absolute life, the appearance in human history of personalities and careers which seem superhuman when judged by the surface mind. Such activity, such a bringing forth of the fruits of the spirit, may take many forms. But where it is absent, where we meet with personal satisfactions, personal visions or raptures, however sublime and spiritualized, presented as marks of the unitive way, ends or objects of the quest of reality, we may be sure that we have wandered from the straight and narrow road, which leads not to eternal rest, but to eternal life. The fourth degree of love is spiritually fruitful, says Richard of St. Victor. Wherever we find a sterile love, a holy passivity, we are in the presence of quietistic heresy, not of the unitive life. I hold it for a certain truth, says St. Teresa, that in giving these graces our Lord intends, as I have often told you, to strengthen our weakness, so that we may imitate him by suffering much. Whence did St. Paul draw strength to support his immense labours? We see clearly in him the effects of visions and contemplations which come indeed from our Lord and not from our own imagination or the devil's fraud. Do you suppose St. Paul hid himself in order to enjoy in peace these spiritual consolations, and did nothing else? You know that on the contrary he never took a day's rest, so far as we can learn, and worked at night in order to earn his bread. O my sisters, how forgetful of her own ease, how careless of honours should she be whose soul God thus chooses for his special dwelling-place. For if her mind is fixed on him, as it ought to be, she must needs forget herself. All her thoughts are bent on how to please him better, and when and how she may show him her love. This is the end and aim of prayer, my daughters. This is the object of that spiritual marriage whose children are always good works. Works are the best proof that the favours which we receive have come from God. To give our Lord a perfect hospitality, she says in the same chapter, Mary and Martha must combine. When we look at the lives of the great theopathetic mystics, the true initiates of eternity, inarticulate as these mystics often are, we find ourselves in the presence of an amazing, a superabundant vitality, of a triumphing force over which circumstance has no power. The incessant production of good work seems indeed to be the object of that spirit by whose presence the interior castle is now filled. We see St. Paul, abruptly enslaved by the first and only fair, not hiding himself to enjoy the vision of reality, but going out single-handed to organize the Catholic Church. We ask how it was possible for an obscure Roman citizen, without money, influence, or good health, to lay these colossal foundations. And he answers, "Not I, but Christ in me." We see St. Joan of Arc, a child of the peasant class, leaving the sheepfold to lead the armies of France. We ask her how this incredible thing can be, and are told her voices bade her. A message, an overpowering impulse, came from the suprasensible. Vitality flowed in on her, she knew not how or why. She was united with the infinite life, and became its agent, the medium of its strength, what his own hand is to a man. We see St. Francis, God's troubadour, marked with his wounds, inflamed with his joy, obverse and reverse of the earnest money of eternity. Or St. Ignatius Loyola, Our Lady's knight, a figure at once militant and romantic, go out to change the spiritual history of Europe. Where did they find, born and bred to the most ordinary of careers, in the least spiritual of atmospheres, that superabundant energy, that genius for success which triumphed best in the most hopeless situations? Francis found it before the crucifix in St. Damiano, and renewed it in the ineffable experience of La Verna, when by mental possession and rapture he was transfigured of God. Ignatius found it in the long contemplations and hard discipline of the cave of Manresa, after the act of surrender in which he dedicated his knighthood to the service of the Mother of God. We see St. Teresa, another born romantic, pass to the unitive state after long and bitter struggle with 2 houses, where the most austere and exalted life of contemplation shall be led. she enters upon this task to the accompaniment of an almost universal mockery. Mysteriously as she proceeds, novices of the spiritual life appear and cluster around her. They come into existence, one knows not how, in the least favourable of atmospheres. But one and all are salted with the Teresian salt. They receive the infection of her abundant vitality, embrace eagerly and joyously the heroic life of the Reform. In the end, every city in Spain has within it Teresa's spiritual children, a whole order of contemplatives, as truly born of her as if they were indeed her sons and daughters in the flesh. Well might the spiritual alchemist say that the true lapis philosophorum is a tinging stone, which imparts its goldness to the base metals brought within its sphere of influence. This reproductive power is one of the greatest marks of the theopathetic life, the true mystic marriage of the individual soul with its source. Those rare personalities in whom it is found are the media through which that triumphing spiritual life, which is the essence of reality, forces an entrance into the temporal order and begets children, heirs of the superabundant vitality of the transcendental universe. But the unit of life is more than the sum total of its symptoms, more than the heroic and apostolic life of the great active, more than the divine motherhood of new sons and daughters of the Absolute. These are only its outward signs, its expression in time and space. I have first laid stress upon that expression, because it is the side which all critics and some friends of the mystics persistently ignore. The contemplative's power of living this intense and creative life within the temporal order, however, is tightly bound up with that other life in which he attains the complete communion with the absolute order, and submits to the inflow of its supernal vitality. In discussing the relation of the mystical experience to philosophy, we saw that the complete mystic consciousness, and therefore, of course, the complete mystic world, had a twofold character which could hardly be reconciled with the requirements of monism. It embraced a reality which seems from the human standpoint at once static and dynamic, transcendent and immanent, eternal and temporal, accepted both the absolute world of pure being and the unresting world of becoming as integral parts of its vision of truth, demanding on its side a dual response. All through the mystic way we caught glimpses of the growth and exercise of this dual intuition of the real. Now the mature mystic, having come to his full stature, passed through the purifications of sense and of spirit, and entered on his heritage, must and does take up as a part of that heritage, not merely a fruition of the divine goodness, truth, and beauty, his place within the sempiternal rose, nor b the creative activity of an agent of the eternal wisdom, still immersed in the river of life, but both together, the twofold destiny of the spiritual man, called to incarnate the eternal in time. To use the old scholastic language, he is at once patient and agent, patient as regards God, agent as regards the world. In a deep sense, it may be said of him that he now participates according to his measure in that divine human life which mediates between man and the eternal and constitutes the salvation of the world. Therefore, though his outward heroic life of action, his divine fecundity, may seem to us the best evidence of his state, it is the inner knowledge of his mystical sonship whereby we feel eternal life in us above all other thing, which is for him the guarantee of absolute life. He has many ways of describing this central fact, this peculiar consciousness of his own transcendence, which coexists with and depends on a complete humility. Sometimes he says that whereas in the best moments of his natural life he was but the faithful servant of the eternal order, and in the illuminated way became its secret friend, he is now advanced to the final, most mysterious state of hidden child. How great, says Rusbroek, is the difference between the secret friend and the hidden child! For the friend makes only loving, living, but measured ascents towards God. But the child presses on to lose his own life upon the summits, in that simplicity which knoweth not itself, when we transcend ourselves and become in our ascent towards God so simple that the bare supreme love can lay hold of us, then we cease, and we and all our selfhood die in God. And in this death we become the hidden children of God and find a new life within us. Though the outer career of the great mystic, then, be one of superhuman industry, a long fight with evil and adversity, his real and inner life dwells securely upon the heights, in the perfect fruition which he can only suggest to us by the paradoxical symbols of ignorance and emptiness. He dominates existence because he thus transcends it, is a son of God, a member of the eternal order, shares its substantial life. Tranquillity according to his essence, activity according to his nature, absolute repose, absolute fecundity. This, says Rusbroek again, is the twofold property of Godhead, and the secret child of the Absolute participates in this dual character of reality, for this dignity has man been made. Those two aspects of truth which he has so clumsily classified as static and dynamic, as being and becoming, now find their final reconciliation within his own nature, for that nature has become conscious in all its parts, has unified itself about its highest elements. That strange, tormenting vision of a perfect peace, a joyous self-loss, annihilation in some mighty life that overpassed his own, which haunts man throughout the whole course of his history, and finds a more or less distorted expression in all his creeds, a justification in all his ecstasies, is now traced to its source, and found to be the inevitable expression of an instinct by which he recognized, though he could not attain, the noblest part of his inheritance. This recognition of his has of necessity been imperfect and oblique. It has taken in many temperaments an exaggerated form, and has been further disguised by the symbolic language used to describe it. The tendency of Indian mysticism to regard the unitive life wholly in its passive aspect, as a total self-annihilation, a disappearance into the substance of the Godhead, results, I believe, from such a distortion of truth. The Oriental mystic presses on to lose his life upon the heights, but he does not come back and bring to his fellow men the life-giving news that he has transcended mortality in the interests of the race. The temperamental bias of Western mystics towards activity has saved them as a rule from such one-sided achievement as this, and hence it is in them that the unitive life, with its dual character of activity and rest, has assumed its richest and noblest forms. Of these Western mystics, none has expressed more lucidly or splendidly than Rusbroek the double nature of man's reaction to reality. It is the heart of his vision of truth. In all his books he returns to it again and again, speaking, as none familiar with his writings can doubt, the ardent, joyous, vital language of first-hand experience, not the platitudes of philosophy. He might say with Dante, his forerunner into the Empyrean, La forma universal di questa noda, credo ch'io vidi, pesce più di largo dicendo questo, mi sento ch'io godo. I believe that I beheld the universal form of this knot, because in saying this I feel my joy increased. It is then from Rusbroek that I shall make my quotations, and if they be found somewhat long and difficult of comprehension, their unique importance for the study of man's spiritual abilities must be my excuse. First, his vision of God. The divine persons, he says, who form one sole God, are in the fecundity of their nature ever active, and in the simplicity of their essence they form the Godhead in eternal blessedness. Thus God, according to the persons, is eternal work, but according to the essence and its perpetual stillness, he is eternal rest. Now love and fruition live between this activity and this rest. Love would ever be active, for its nature is eternal working with God. Fruition is ever at rest, for it consists above all will and all desire, and in the embrace of the well-beloved by the well-beloved in a simple and imageless love, wherein the Father, together with the Son, enfolds his beloved ones in the fruitive unity of his spirit, above the fecundity of nature. And that same Father says to each soul in his infinite loving kindness, "Thou art mine, and I am thine. I am thine, and thou art mine, for I have chosen thee from all eternity." Next, the vision of the self's destiny. Our activity consists in loving God, and our fruition in enduring God and being penetrated by his love. There is a distinction between love and fruition, as there is between God and his grace. When we unite ourselves to God by love, then we are spirit. But when we are caught up and transformed by his Spirit, then we are led into fruition. And the Spirit of God himself breathes us out from himself that we may love and may do good works. And again he draws us into himself that we may rest in fruition. And this is eternal life, even as our mortal life subsists in the indrawing and outgoing of our breath. Understand, he says again, God comes to us incessantly, both with means and without means, and he demands of us both action and fruition, in such a way that the action never hinders the fruition, nor the fruition the action, but they strengthen one another. And this is why the interior man, i.e. the contemplative, lives his life according to these two ways, that is to say, in rest and in work. And in each of them he is wholly and undividedly, for he dwells wholly in God in virtue of his restful fruition, and wholly in himself in virtue of his active love.
End of Part 2, Chapter 10. Far from being academic or unreal, that history, I think, is vital for the deeper understanding of the history of humanity. It shows us, upon high levels, the psychological process to which every self which desires to rise to the perception of reality must submit, the formula under which man's spiritual consciousness, be it strong or weak, must necessarily unfold. In the great mystics we see the highest and widest development of that consciousness to which the human race has yet attained. We see its growth exhibited to us on a grand scale, perceptible of all men. The stages of its slow transcendence of the sense world, marked by episodes of splendour and of terror, which are hard for common men to accept or understand as a part of the organic process of life. But the germ of that same transcendent life, the spring of the amazing energy which enables the great mystic to rise to freedom and dominate his world, is latent in all of us, an integral part of our humanity. Where the mystic has a genius for the absolute, we have each a little buried talent, some greater, some less. And the growth of this talent, this spark of the soul, once we permit its emergence, will conform in little, and according to its measure, to those laws of organic growth, those inexorable conditions of transcendence which we found to govern the mystic way. Every person, then, who awakens to consciousness of a reality which transcends the normal world of sense, however small, weak, imperfect that consciousness may be, is put upon a road which follows at low levels the path which the mystic treads at high levels. The success with which he follows this way to freedom and full life will depend on the intensity of his love and will, his capacity for self-discipline, his steadfastness and courage. It will depend on the generosity and completeness of his outgoing passion for absolute beauty, absolute goodness, or absolute truth. But if he move at all, he will move through a series of states which are, in their own small way, analogous to those experienced by the greatest contemplative on his journey towards that union with God, which is the term of the spirit's ascent towards its home. As the embryo of physical man, be he saint or savage, passes through the same stages of initial growth, so too with spiritual man. When the new birth takes place in him, the new life process of his deeper self begins. The normal individual, no less than the mystic, will know that spiral ascent towards higher levels, those oscillations of consciousness between light and darkness, those odd mental disturbances, abrupt invasions from the subliminal region, and disconcerting glimpses of truth, which accompany the growth of the transcendental powers, though he may well interpret them in other than the mystic sense. He too will be impelled to drastic self-discipline, to a deliberate purging of his eyes that he may see, and receiving a new vision of the world, will be spurred by it to a total self-dedication, an active surrender of his whole being to that aspect of the infinite which he has perceived. He too will endure in little the psychic upheavals of the spiritual adolescence, will be forced to those sacrifices which every form of genius demands. He will know according to his measure the dreadful moments of lucid self-knowledge, the counterbalancing ecstasy of an intuition of the real. More and more, as we study and collate all the available evidence, this fact, this law, is borne in on us, that the general movement of human consciousness, when it obeys its innate tendency to transcendence, is always the same. There is only one road from appearance to reality. Men pass on, but the states are permanent forever. I do not care whether the consciousness be that of artist or musician, striving to catch and fix some aspect of the heavenly light or music, and denying all other aspects of the world in order to devote themselves to this, or of the humble servant of science, purging his intellect that he may look upon her secrets with innocence of eye, whether the higher reality be perceived in the terms of religion, beauty, suffering, of human love, of goodness, or of truth. However widely these forms of transcendence may seem to differ, the mystic experience is the key to them all. All in their different ways are exhibitions here and now of the eternal, extensions of man's consciousness which involve calls to heroic endeavour, incentives to the remaking of character about new and higher centres of life. Through each, man may rise to freedom and take his place in the great movement of the universe, may understand by dancing that which is done. Each brings the self who receives its revelation in good faith, does not check it by self-regarding limitations, to a humble acceptance of the universal law of knowledge, the law that we behold that which we are, and hence that only the real can know reality. Awakening, discipline, enlightenment, self-surrender, and union are the essential phases of life's response to this fundamental fact, the conditions of our attainment of being, the necessary formula under which alone our consciousness of any of these fringes of eternity, any of these aspects of the transcendent, can unfold, develop, attain to freedom and full life. We are, then, one and all the kindred of the mystics, and it is by dwelling upon this kinship, by interpreting, so far as we may, their great declarations in the light of our little experience, that we shall learn to understand them best. Strange and far away though they seem, they are not cut off from us by some impassable abyss. They belong to us. They are our brethren, the giants, the heroes of our race. As the achievement of genius belongs not to itself only, but also to the society that brought it forth, as theology declares that the merits of the saints avail for all, so, because of the solidarity of the human family, the supernal accomplishment of the mystics is ours also. Their attainment is the earnest money of our eternal life. To be a mystic is simply to participate here and now in that real and eternal life, in the fullest, deepest sense which is possible to man. It is to share, as a free and conscious agent, not a servant but a son, in the joyous travail of the universe, its mighty onward sweep through pain and glory towards its home in God. This gift of sonship, this power of free cooperation in the world process, is man's greatest honour. The ordered sequence of states, the organic development, whereby his consciousness is detached from illusion and rises to the mystic freedom which conditions instead of being conditioned by its normal world, is the way he must tread if that sonship is to be realized. Only by this deliberate fostering of his deeper self,
this transmutation of the elements of his character, can he reach those levels of consciousness upon which he hears and responds to, the measure whereto the worlds keep time, on their great pilgrimage towards the Father's heart. The mystic act of union, that joyous loss of the transfigured self in God, which is the crown of man's conscious ascent towards the Absolute, is the contribution of the individual to this, the destiny of the cosmos. The mystic knows that destiny. It is laid bare to his lucid vision, as our puzzling world of form and colour is to normal sight. He is the hidden child of the eternal order, an initiate of the secret plan. Hence, whilst all creation groaneth and travaileth, slowly moving under the spur of blind desire towards that consummation in which alone it can have rest, he runs eagerly along the pathway to reality. He is the pioneer of life on its age-long voyage to the One, and shows us in his attainment the meaning and value of that life. This meaning, this secret plan of creation, flames out, had we eyes to see, from every department of existence. Its exultant declarations come to us in all great music. Its magic is the life of all romance. Its law, the law of love, is the substance of the beautiful, the energizing cause of the heroic. It lights the altar of every creed. All man's dreams and diagrams concerning a transcendent perfection, near him yet intangible, a transcendent vitality to which he can attain, whether he call these objects of desire God, grace, being, spirit, beauty, pure idea, are but translations of his deeper self's intuition of its destiny, clumsy fragmentary hints at the all-inclusive, living absolute which that deeper self knows to be real. This supernal thing, the adorable substance of all that is, the synthesis of wisdom, power, and love, and man's apprehension of it, his slow remaking in its interests, his union with it at last, this is the theme of mysticism, that twofold extension of consciousness which allows him communion with its transcendent and immanent aspects is, in all its gradual processes, the mystic way. It is also the crown of human evolution, the fulfilment of life, the liberation of personality from the world of appearance, its entrance into the free creative life of the real. Further, Christians may well remark that the psychology of Christ, as presented to us in the Gospels, is of a piece with that of the mystics. In its pain and splendour, its dual character of action and fruition, it reflects their experience upon the supernal plane of more abundant life. Thanks to this fact, for them the ladder of contemplation, that ladder which medieval thought counted as an instrument of the passion, discerning it as essential to the true salvation of man, stretches without a break from earth to the Empyrean. It leans against the cross. It leads to the secret rose. By it the ministers of goodness, truth, and beauty go up and down between the transcendent and the apparent world. Seen, then, from whatever standpoint we may choose to adopt, whether of psychology, philosophy, or religion, the adventure of the great mystics intimately concerns us. It is a master key to man's puzzle. By its help he may explain much in his mental make-up, in his religious constructions, in his experience of life. In all these departments he perceives himself to be climbing slowly and clumsily upward towards some attainment yet unseen. The mystics, expert mountaineers, go before him, and show him, if he cares to learn, the way to freedom, to reality, to peace. He cannot rise in this, his earthly existence, to the awful and solitary peak, veiled in the cloud of unknowing, where they meet that death of the summit, which is declared by them to be the gate of perfect life. But if he choose to profit by their explorations, he may find his level, his place within the eternal order. He may achieve freedom, live the independent spiritual life.
Consider once more the mystic way as we have traced it from its beginning. To what does it tend if not to this? It began by the awakening within the self of a new and embryonic consciousness, a consciousness of divine reality, as opposed to the illusory sense world in which she was immersed. Humbled, awed by the august possibilities then revealed to her, that self retreated into the cell of self-knowledge, and there laboured to adjust herself to the eternal order which she had perceived, stripped herself of all that opposed it, disciplined her energies, purified the organs of sense. Remade in accordance with her intuitions of reality, the eternal hearing and seeing were revealed in her. She opened her eyes upon a world still natural, but no longer illusory, since it was perceived to be illuminated by the uncreated light. She knew then the beauty, the majesty, the divinity of the living world of becoming, which holds in its meshes every living thing. She had transcended the narrow rhythm by which common men perceive but one of its many aspects, escaped the machine-made universe presented by the cinematograph of sense, and participated in the great life of the all. Reality came forth to her, since her eyes were cleansed to see it, not from some strange far-off and spiritual country, but gently from the very heart of things. Thus lifted to a new level, she began again her ceaseless work of growth, and because by the cleansing of the senses she had learned to see the reality which is shadowed by the sense world, she now, by the cleansing of her will, sought to draw nearer to that eternal will, that being, which life, the world of becoming, manifests and serves. Thus, by the surrender of her selfhood in its wholeness, the perfecting of her love, she slid from becoming to being, and found her true life hidden in God. Yet the course of this transcendence, this amazing inward journey, was closely linked, first and last, with the processes of human life. It sprang from that life as man springs from the sod. We were even able to describe it under those symbolic formulae which we are accustomed to call the laws of the natural world. By an extension of these formulae, their logical application, we discovered a path which led us without a break from the sensible to the suprasensible, from apparent to absolute life. There is nothing unnatural about the absolute of the mystics. He sets the rhythm of his own universe and conforms to the harmonies which he has made. We, deliberately seeking for that which we suppose to be spiritual, too often overlook that which alone is real. The true mysteries of life accomplish themselves so softly, with so easy and assured a grace, so frank an acceptance of our breeding, striving, dying, and unresting world, that the unimaginative natural man, all agog for the marvellous, is hardly startled by their daily and radiant revelation of infinite wisdom and love. Yet this revelation presses incessantly upon us. Only the hard crust of surface consciousness conceals it from our normal sight. In some least expected moment, the common activities of life in progress, that reality in whom the mystics dwell, slips through our closed doors, and suddenly we see it at our side. It was said of the disciples at Emmaus, Mensem igitor ponunt panes cibosque offerunt, et Deum, quem in scripturae sacrae expositione non cognoverant, in panis fractione cognoscunt. So too for us the transcendent life for which we crave is revealed and our living within it, not on some remote and arid plane of being, in the cunning explanations of philosophy, but in the normal acts of our diurnal experience, suddenly made significant for us, not in the backwaters of existence, not amongst subtle arguments and occult doctrines, but in all those places where the direct and simple life of earth goes on. It is found in the soul of man so long as that soul is alive and growing. It is not found in any sterile place. This fact of experience is our link with the mystics, our guarantee of the truthfulness of their statements,
the supreme importance of their adventure, their closer contact with reality. The mystics, on their part, are our guarantee of the end towards which the immanent love, the hidden steersman which dwells in our midst, is moving, our lovely forerunners on the path towards the real. They come back to us from an encounter with life's most august secret, as Mary came running from the tomb, filled with amazing tidings which they can hardly tell. We, longing for some assurance, and seeing their radiant faces, urge them to pass on their revelation if they can. It is the old demand of the dim-sighted and incredulous, Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via. But they cannot say, can only report fragments of the symbolic vision. Angelicus testis, sudarium et vestis. Not the inner content, the final divine certainty. We must ourselves follow in their footsteps if we would have that. Like the story of the cross, so too the story of man's spirit ends in a garden, in a place of birth and fruitfulness, of beautiful and natural things. Divine fecundity is its secret, existence not for its own sake, but for the sake of a more abundant life. It ends with the coming forth of divine humanity, never again to leave us, living in us and with us, a pilgrim, a worker, a guest at our table, a sharer at all hazards in life. The mystics witness to this story, waking very early they have run on before us, urged by the greatness of their love. We, incapable as yet of this sublime encounter, looking in their magic mirror, listening to their stammered tidings, may see far off the consummation of the race. According to the measure of their strength and of their passion, these, the true lovers of the Absolute, have conformed here and now to the utmost tests of divine sonship, the final demands of life. They have not shrunk from the sufferings of the cross. They have faced the darkness of the tomb. Beauty and agony alike have called them, alike have awakened a heroic response. For them the winter is over, the time of the singing of birds is come. From the deeps of the dewy garden, life, new, unquenchable, and ever lovely, comes to meet them with the dawn. Et hoc intelligere, quis bominum dabit bominae, quis angelus angelo, quis angelus bominae, el te patatur, in te quaeratur, el depulsitur, sic accipietur invenietur, sic aperietur. End of part 2, conclusion. End of part 2. End of mysticism.